Her name was Belle, a true crime story of Belle Gunness. Written by Alana Sanchez, narrated by Vivienne. Copyright 2025 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, stored on electronic devices, or distributed without written permission of the author. Author's note. This book is a work of historical reconstruction grounded in surviving records, not a claim of total knowledge. The figure known as Belle Gunness has been written about for more than a century, often in tones that favor certainty over documentation and spectacle over process. Numbers have grown where evidence thins. Motives have hardened where records fall silent. Over time, the story has become louder than the archive that produced it. This work proceeds in the opposite direction. Rather than attempting to resolve every uncertainty, it traces how uncertainty itself was produced, managed, and constrained by the institutions that encountered Belle Gunness during her lifetime. Courts, coroners, insurers, police departments, and newspapers did not reveal a single unified truth. They generated parallel records, each shaped by its own rules, limits, and incentives. Those limits matter. Many of the men who vanished in this case traveled deliberately without companions, converted their assets to cash, and left behind little formal documentation. Their absence from the archive is not accidental. It is a function of how mobility, anonymity, and institutional attention operated in the early 20th century, and in many ways, continue to operate now. This book resists retroactive psychological diagnosis. No definitive motive is proposed. Behavior is examined not through interior speculation, but through interaction with systems: how letters were written, how money moved, how land was owned, how remains were handled, how language was constrained by law. Where interpretation exceeds evidence, that excess has been deliberately withheld. Victim counts are likewise treated with caution. The historical record does not support a precise total, and this book does not impose one. Fragmentation, loss, and disturbance limit certainty, and those limits are acknowledged rather than resolved narratively. In telling this story, I have relied heavily on procedural language, sometimes at the expense of drama, because procedure is where power is exercised quietly and effectively. It is also where myth often begins, when restraint is mistaken for evasion and silence is filled by imagination. This is not a book about monstrosity. It is a book about legibility, about what institutions are able to see, what they are structured to ignore, and what remains once systems have done their work. If the account feels incomplete, that incompleteness is intentional. It reflects the record as it exists, not as we might wish it to be. What remains is not mystery in the romantic sense, but residue, documents, fragments, and absences that continue to resist full containment. This book leaves them there. Preface. This book begins where certainty fails. The land in LaPorte County, Indiana, no longer looks remarkable. It has been leveled, sold, repurposed. What once drew attention now absorbs it. The ground does not announce what it has held, and the records that describe it do so only partially, in careful language shaped by rule and restraint. What survives of Belle Gunness exists largely in fragments: documents that do not align cleanly, testimony constrained by credibility, objects separated from owners, and numbers that grow less stable the closer they are examined. The archive is crowded, but it is not complete. That incompleteness is the point. Most accounts of this case attempt to overcome absence by force, substituting conjecture for record and scale for evidence. This book does not. It proceeds from the assumption that what cannot be proven matters, not because it can be resolved, but because it reveals the limits of the systems that encountered it. Belle Gunness was not invisible to those systems. She was legible to them, as a property owner, as a widow, as a correspondent, as a claimant, as a defendant. Each institution recorded her according to its own needs, producing versions that were internally coherent and collectively incomplete. Those versions did not converge. What follows is not an effort to unify them into a single narrative truth, but to examine how they coexist, how they conflict, and how meaning emerges, or fails to emerge, from their overlap. This is a book about procedure as much as about crime. About how records are made, how suspicion forms without accusation, how evidence is narrowed rather than expanded, and how resolution often arrives not as understanding, but as closure imposed by rule. Readers looking for revelation will not find it here. What they will find instead is accumulation, letters unanswered, remains catalogued without names, hearings that reduce lives to admissible fact. This accumulation is not neutral. It shapes memory. It determines what endures. The story of Belle Gunness persists not because it is fully known, but because it resists being fully contained. Each retelling attempts to close the gap between record and imagination. This one does not. It stays with the gap. Chapter 1: Stone and Winter. The first thing Brynhild learned about hunger was that it had arithmetic. In Selbu, winter did not arrive like a visitor. It arrived like a debt. The lake froze into a dull sheet of pewter, the birches stiffened into pale bones, and the air itself became something you had to work through before it would let you breathe. The men called it a clean cold, good Norwegian cold, honest, not like the damp rot of other places. Honest cold still killed. Her father kept his accounts in his head. Not numbers the way the pastor kept them, locked in ink and scripture, but quieter reckonings: how many days the flour would last if the porridge were thinned, how much lamp oil remained in the tin, how much of the pig could be spared before spring, how long a child could cough before someone had to barter for a doctor. When Brynhild was small, she assumed every household lived this way. A family held together by work and careful fractions. A mouth was a mouth. A mouth was a cost. Her mother's hands were always wet. Not merely from washing, though there was plenty of that, but from the way she moved through chores as if she were forever wringing the day out of itself. Clothes. Floors. Milk cloths. Tears, when she believed no one was watching. Brynhild watched anyway. She was the sort of girl who looked as though she were listening even when she was not, which meant adults spoke freely around her. They used words like husman and fatigkas as if they were weather. Tenant. Poor fund. The words drifted through the house and settled in corners like soot. It was not that she was unloved. Selbu had love the way it had stone, abundant, rough, used for foundations. It kept you standing. It did not keep you warm. On Sundays she sat in the church with her family and stared at the polished wood and the pale, unyielding faces of saints. The pastor's voice rose and fell in the same cadence each week, a rhythm that promised order to people whose lives contained very little of it. What she noticed, even then, was how much of life depended on the story other people agreed to believe. When the pastor spoke of sin, everyone understood. When he spoke of mercy, they bowed their heads as if to catch it before it struck the floor and shattered. When her father spoke of rent, her mother's jaw tightened. When he spoke of opportunity, stonework, seasonal labor, she nodded, but her hands kept moving, as though motion itself might push fear back out the door. Brynhild learned to work early. Not because anyone demanded it with cruelty. There was no time for cruelty, not with animals to feed and water to carry and clothes to mend, but because idleness was a luxury reserved for people who could afford mistakes. Neighbors said she was strong for a girl. They meant it as praise, but she heard it as description, like saying the stove was hot. Strength was not a blessing. Strength was what happened when the world made it clear it would not carry you. She carried herself anyway. Sometimes, on the paths between farms, she passed older girls, service girls with their hair pinned tight, walking in pairs, laughing too loudly at nothing. Their laughter did not sound like happiness. It sounded like defiance. She wanted that sound. Not the laughter itself, but what it announced: I am still here. One afternoon, when the snow had half melted and the ground turned to sucking mud, her mother sent her to a neighbor's farm with a pail. Don't linger, her mother said, wiping her hands on her apron. Bring it straight back. Brynhild nodded and took the path like a promise. The neighbor's yard was littered with split wood. A man she did not recognize stood in the doorway, speaking with the woman of the house. He wore city clothes, better wool, boots without patches, a hat that held its shape. He smiled indulgently, as though everyone here belonged to a story he found quaint. Brynhild felt her face still. The man's eyes dropped to the pail. And who's this? Another little worker. The woman answered for her. That's Paul Storset's girl. Oh, the man said, stretching the sound. The tenant's. Tenant, as though it were her name. Brynhild tightened her grip on the pail handle, not enough to show, just enough to feel the ache in her fingers. The man spoke then of America. Not in sermons or scripture, but in figures that made people listen. Wages, prices, meat on the table, land you could own instead of beg permission to use. He spoke as if the world were a marketplace and a person could step from one stall to another and alter their life simply by choosing differently. Brynhild did not believe him. Not entirely. But the idea lodged anyway. On the walk home, the mud pulled at her boots. Her calves burned. The pail sloshed, cold and heavy. She thought of her father's hunger arithmetic, the way every choice in Selbu seemed already calculated against you. Then she thought of the man's boots, whole boots, boots that belonged to someone who had never had to decide whether a child's cough was worth a coin. She did not want boots. She wanted the kind of life where no one could call you tenant and have it define your place in the world. When she returned, her mother took the pail and nodded approval at her speed. Good. Brynhild stood in the doorway and watched steam rise from the pot on the stove. Watched her mother's wet hands. Watched her father's shoulders, bowed not in prayer but in calculation. She understood then, with unsettling calm, that love would not change their mathematics. Only money would. And money, in Selbu, belonged to other people. Chapter 2, The Lesson of Bruises. Years later, when Americans tried to explain her, they would look for a moment, a single obedient incident they could pin to her like a label. A bruise. A blow. A betrayal neat enough to be underlined. They would want an origin that behaved itself. Selbu did not offer such things. It offered accumulation. Pain arrived the way winter did, gradually, then all at once. A season of small indignities that hardened into something permanent. By the time you noticed it, it was already structural. Brynhild learned early that bodies were tools before they were anything else. Her father's body bent under stone work, his hands permanently swollen, knuckles thickened like knots in old timber. Her mother's body carried quieter marks, widened hips from childbirth, wrists stiff from washing, a cough that lingered through winters and never entirely left. People spoke of health as though it were a moral achievement. Strong families were respectable. Weak ones were careless. Brynhild listened carefully to how necessity became judgment with only a slight turn of the tongue. Men who came to the farm spoke to her as if she were unfinished. A future wife. A body that would one day belong to someone else. They asked how old she was, how tall she might grow, whether she was strong like her mother. She answered politely. She learned early to keep her face open and her thoughts closed. The lesson of bruises was not taught through cruelty. It was taught through indifference. Once, when she was still young enough to be surprised by pain, a man, drunk, careless, familiar enough not to fear consequence, grabbed her arm too hard while laughing at something she had not said. His fingers left marks, deep and blooming, purple shadows that lived beneath her sleeve for days. When her mother saw them, she said nothing at first. Then she sighed, not sharply, not angrily, but with the weariness of someone who had expected this and resented being proven right. You must be careful, her mother said. Men don't always know their strength. Brynhild waited. She waited for anger. For outrage. For the promise that this would not happen again. None came. That was the lesson. Not that men caused harm, that was already assumed, but that the world adjusted itself around that harm instead of resisting it. From then on, Brynhild paid attention to how people explained injury. How responsibility slid away from the person who inflicted it and settled instead on the one who endured it. Too close. Too quiet. Too tempting. Too slow to move aside. Pain, she learned, did not grant authority. Money did. She also learned how unreliable memory could be. Bruises faded. Stories softened. What remained was what could be proven, and proof required witnesses, records, and someone willing to care. Selbu cared about many things. Order. Reputation. Survival. It did not care about a girl's arm. Brynhild stopped expecting protection. Instead, she began to cultivate density. She learned how to absorb impact without splintering. How to stand so that force distributed itself rather than collapsing inward. She learned to observe. Who flinched? Who laughed? Who apologized before being asked? Who pretended nothing had happened at all? She discovered that power was rarely loud. It was practical. It belonged to people who decided what mattered, and what could be ignored. That understanding settled into her quietly, like a second spine. Chapter 3, The Church Ledger. The church was the only building in Selbu that seemed unmoved by winter. Its walls were thick, its windows narrow, its doors heavy enough to prevent the cold from rushing in all at once. Inside, the air smelled of wood polish, old breath, and candle wax. Time behaved differently there. It slowed. It submitted. Brynhild liked the church because it was honest about records. Names were written down. Births. Marriages. Deaths. If you existed, you were accounted for, at least on paper. If you did not, it was as though you had never been. She noticed the books long before she could read them properly. She watched the pastor handle them with care, as though the pages themselves might bruise if treated roughly. He paused before writing a name, checked spelling, sometimes frowned and asked a question before committing ink to the page. This, she realized, was authority. Not the sermon. Not the prayers. The ledger. Her father's name appeared there with small annotations: tenant, laborer. Notes that looked harmless but carried weight. When the pastor read from the book, those notes shaped how people listened. They explained who you were allowed to be. Brynhild watched funerals closely. The dead did not speak, but the living spoke for them. They described diligence, generosity, faith. Rough edges were smoothed away. Inconvenient details ignored. A life, she learned, could be edited. Sometimes the editing was kind. Sometimes it was cruel. Once, a woman from a neighboring farm died suddenly. People whispered, illness, neglect, perhaps something worse, but when the pastor spoke, he said only that she had been called home. Her husband wept loudly, theatrically. No one questioned him. Brynhild watched how easily grief performed innocence. Afterwards, in the churchyard, people discussed the farm, the animals, the children. Who might take over the work? Whether the youngest would be sent away. No one spoke of the woman herself beyond a few soft adjectives. It struck Brynhild then that death was not an ending. It was a negotiation. What remained depended on who survived you, and what they needed. She began to understand that the church did not dispense truth. It dispensed consensus. If enough people agreed on a story, it became real. The thought did not frighten her. It steadied her. At home, her mother kept a different kind of ledger, scraps of paper folded and refolded, tucked into a drawer, figures written in blunt pencil. Flour. Milk. Rent. Always rent. Brynhild sometimes helped her copy numbers, careful to keep columns straight. She liked the way numbers behaved. They did not argue. They did not soften or exaggerate. If you had enough, you had enough. If you did not, no amount of virtue would make the difference disappear. The church taught her that stories governed people. The household taught her that money governed stories. She stored both lessons carefully. When she finally learned to read properly, she returned to the church books with new eyes. Names repeated. Families thinned. Certain surnames disappeared entirely, as though erased by time itself. She wondered what it would take to vanish that cleanly. Not through scandal or disgrace, but through simple omission. The idea lingered with her long after the service ended, long after the cold bit at her fingers on the walk home. In Selbu, people believed that God saw everything. Brynhild began to suspect that God, like everyone else, relied on records. And records, she was learning, could be managed. Chapter 4. A Girl Learns Weight. By the time Brynhild reached her full height, people stopped qualifying their praise. She was no longer strong for a girl. She was simply strong. The distinction mattered. Her body settled into itself with an inevitability that surprised even her. Shoulders broadened. Hips anchored. Hands thickened, the skin toughened by work and weather until it resisted pain the way leather resisted water. She moved with economy now, wasting nothing, not effort, not breath. People noticed. Men noticed first. Their glances changed from indulgent to appraising, from dismissive to evaluative. Some admired her openly, speaking of her as though she were a tool unusually well made. Others bristled, unsettled by strength they had not been invited to approve. Women noticed more quietly. They watched the way Brynhild lifted, carried, endured. Some borrowed her methods. Others kept their distance, as though strength might demand something of them in return. Brynhild learned quickly which attention carried risk. Strength invited testing. She was given the heaviest loads without discussion. When a cot stuck, she was called. When water needed hauling from a distance, her name surfaced easily, as though effort were a resource that belonged to her by default. No one asked whether she was tired. Praise came late, if at all. When it did, it was framed as inevitability. Of course she could manage it. As though her capacity were not an achievement but a correction. She did not argue. Argument wasted energy. Instead, she refined her efficiency. She learned how to shift weight so it settled into bone rather than muscle. How to pause without appearing idle. How to eat enough when food was scarce by volunteering for the work that ended nearest the kitchen. She learned that usefulness, correctly deployed, functioned as a kind of shelter. But even usefulness had boundaries. No matter how reliably she worked, how calmly she endured, she remained what she had always been, a tenant's daughter. A girl without land. Without inheritance. Without a dowry that would command interest. Her future was discussed around her as though she were an object awaiting placement. Marriage proposals were raised vaguely, then set aside. Suitability was mentioned. Prospects weighed aloud with the casual cruelty of people who assumed their judgment carried no cost. Brynhild listened. She did not interrupt. She had already begun to think beyond Selbu, but not in the language of fantasy. She did not imagine comfort or beauty. She imagined leverage. She watched how men spoke of money. Those who had it rarely mentioned it. Those who wanted it spoke of little else. She learned the difference between men who saved and men who speculated, between those who planned and those who relied on fortune to rescue them. She noticed that men who trusted luck often mistook it for character. She also noticed how often women's security rested on events they did not control: birth, marriage, illness, survival. Respectability moved easily, slipping from one state to another with only a thin change of clothing to mark the difference. Widows fascinated her most. They were spoken of with sympathy sharpened by suspicion. They occupied a narrow space between pity and autonomy. They had known male authority and now existed without it, not entirely free, but no longer supervised in the same way. They were watched, but they were also deferred to. Brynhild considered this carefully. Widowhood, she realized, was one of the few socially acceptable ways a woman could possess both money and authority without apology. She did not romanticize it. Romance was a distraction. What interested her was structure, how the role functioned, what it permitted, what it concealed. She imagined her future not as a man beside her, but as a document bearing her name. Clean. Unqualified. Unexplained. She imagined weight differently now. Not the weight she carried on her back or in her arms, but weight that could be stored. Counted. Transferred. Money that did not rot or run away or require feeding. Money that could be made to work. She imagined a life governed not by hunger's arithmetic, but by accumulation. The idea did not yet have detail. It was not a plan. It was an orientation. But orientation, Brynhild was learning, mattered more than hope. Hope waited. Weight moved. Chapter 5, A Letter from America. The letter arrived in late autumn, when the ground had hardened enough to promise winter, but not yet enough to make it unavoidable. It was thicker than the usual correspondence that reached Selbu, the paper stiff and pale, the edges still sharp. The handwriting was careful without being timid, each letter formed as though time itself were plentiful. It had traveled a long way and wanted credit for the distance. Brynhild watched her father read it aloud at the table, his finger moving slowly along the lines as if the words might escape if not guided. He read carefully, stopping now and then to repeat a phrase, to test it for truth. The letter spoke of America the way men spoke of tools they trusted. It listed wages, hours, costs. It named prices without apology and work without shame. Meat appeared casually, as though it were not something to be calculated or earned with particular care. Land was mentioned not as inheritance but as possibility, something a person might acquire through effort rather than blood. Brynhild felt something tighten behind her ribs. Not excitement. Precision. Her mother listened without interrupting, her hands still in her lap for once, fingers resting together instead of worrying fabric or air. When the letter ended, she nodded once. "That's how they make it sound," she said. She did not say it was a lie. In the days that followed, the letter developed a life of its own. Neighbors came to see it, to touch the paper, to comment on the confidence of the hand. America entered conversation not as fantasy but as counter-argument, a place raised whenever someone spoke of limitation. Even the pastor asked questions. Brynhild noticed how the presence of the letter altered tone. Complaints softened. Doubts were reframed. The idea of leaving ceased to sound like abandonment and began to sound like correction. Distance, she realized, carried authority. She listened more than she spoke. She learned who had gone and sent money back, who had gone and returned poorer, who had gone and disappeared entirely. The disappearances interested her most. Not because they were tragic, tragedy was common, but because they were clean. Names that ceased to circulate. Lives that slipped beyond the parish's ability to account for them. Vanishing, she thought, was underestimated. At night, she imagined writing such a letter herself. Not pleading. Not explaining. Simply stating facts. I have work. I am well. I am staying. The simplicity appealed to her. As winter settled in properly, the letter was read again and again, until its phrases became familiar enough to feel almost local. Brynhild noticed which parts her father lingered on, wages, reliability, and which parts her mother absorbed silently, independence, distance. The decision, when it came, did not arrive as an announcement. It assembled itself. Money was counted discreetly. Connections traced carefully. A cousin mentioned. A neighbor consulted. A trunk borrowed and promised back in good condition. Brynhild understood instinctively that leaving was not rebellion. It was investment. She began to prepare herself in ways that surprised her. Not physically, she already knew what her body could endure, but socially. She practiced stillness. Learned to soften her expression without weakening it. Learned when uncertainty reassured and when competence threatened. America, she suspected, would not reward honesty. It would reward credibility. The night before the arrangements were settled, she sat with her mother by the stove. The fire burned low. The house made its familiar sounds, timber contracting, wind testing the walls for weakness. You'll be alone, her mother said. Brynhild nodded. You won't have us, her mother added. I know. Her mother studied her for a long moment, then reached out and smoothed the sleeve of Brynhild's dress, as though checking for bruises that no longer appeared. Don't let them take what you earn, she said quietly. It was not blessing or warning. It was instruction. Brynhild accepted it without sentiment. That night, she did not cry. Crying spent water and produced nothing in return. Instead, she lay awake and rehearsed her name. Its shape. Its weight. How it might sound in another mouth. She did not imagine happiness. She imagined margin. By the time the snow sealed Selbu in again, the decision had already outpaced doubt. America was no longer an idea. It was a direction. Chapter 6, Departure Calculations. Leaving Selbu required less courage than precision. Courage was loud and visible. Precision was quiet and moved ahead of scrutiny. Brynhild understood this instinctively. She approached departure the way she approached work, by breaking it into manageable tasks and completing them without ceremony. The first problem was money. Passage to America was not expensive by legend, but it was expensive in fact. Every coin carried weight. There would be no replacing what was spent once she crossed the water. Brynhild counted the money herself, not because she mistrusted her parents, but because counting made the reality solid. She memorized the total. She memorized what would remain. She learned quickly that emigrant agents spoke in reassurance and charged in precision. Fees were listed vaguely, then clarified only when pressed. Paperwork appeared in stages. Each document required a signature, a stamp, a payment. Brynhild noticed that the process rewarded patience and punished hesitation. Those who asked too many questions were delayed. Those who asked none were cheated. The correct approach lay between attentive but unremarkable. She watched men argue over terms and lose ground. She watched women apologize and lose money. She did neither. She spoke only when necessary. She repeated details back to clerks until they matched. She kept her receipts folded carefully, stored where they would not be damaged by damp or handling. Names mattered. Spellings mattered. Errors traveled. She learned that emigrants were sorted not by destination, but by risk. Families were preferred. Single men tolerated. Single women scrutinized. Questions came quietly. Who would meet her? Where would she stay? How long could she support herself? Brynhild answered without embellishment. She named a contact. She named a place. She did not offer explanations she could not later maintain. She noticed that certainty, even when thin, carried authority. The trunk was borrowed from a neighbor who had once gone and returned. It smelled faintly of salt and tar, its corners reinforced with metal that had dulled from impact. Brynhild packed with discipline. 2 dresses suitable for travel. 1 warmer layer. Underclothes stitched carefully by her mother. A pair of solid boots. Nothing sentimental that could not be replaced. She left space. Space mattered. She learned that luggage was inspected casually but remembered vividly. Excess drew attention. Emptiness suggested preparation. The day of departure arrived without drama. Selbu did not pause for it. Animals were fed. Work continued. Life rearranged itself around absence without complaint. Goodbyes were brief. Her father shook her hand. Her mother embraced her once, firmly, as though committing the shape of her daughter to memory rather than indulging grief. Brynhild did not look back as she walked away. Looking back invited doubt. The journey to the port passed in stages: cart, train, waiting rooms thick with language and fatigue. She observed everything. How tickets were checked and rechecked. How officials separated those who knew where they were going from those who did not. She noticed that confidence moved people through lines faster than entitlement. At the port, the scale of the ship unsettled many. It did not unsettle her. Large things obeyed rules just as small ones did. She queued with the others, papers in hand, trunk marked clearly. Inspections were swift but thorough. Hair checked. Hands examined. Eyes scrutinized for signs of illness. She kept her posture straight and her expression neutral. Illness was not merely physical, it was a reason for refusal. When her name was called, she stepped forward without hesitation. The official pronounced it incorrectly. She corrected him once, calmly. He nodded and wrote something down. Brynhild understood then that correction, when delivered without apology, was often accepted. Once aboard, she located her assigned space and took possession of it without fuss. Others wept, prayed, sang. She arranged her belongings and sat. Departure was not announced. It occurred. When the ship finally moved, Selbu was already distant enough to look unreal, flattened against the horizon like a drawing. Brynhild stood at the rail and watched until it disappeared. She did not feel loss. She felt completion. The calculation had been correct. Chapter 7, Naming. Names, Brynhild learned, were provisional. She understood this before the ship ever docked, watching how officials moved through the steerage lists with brisk indifference. Names were spoken, repeated, altered without ceremony. Some were shortened for convenience. Others were reshaped to fit mouths that had no patience for unfamiliar sounds. No one asked permission. The ship's manifest did not care who a person had been. It cared only whether the ink was legible and the sequence uninterrupted. Brynhild watched this carefully. She observed how men corrected officials angrily and were marked as difficult. How women corrected them apologetically and were ignored. She noticed which passengers let their names be altered without protest and how quickly those altered names became real. She understood then that resistance wasted opportunity. By the time the ship reached port, she had already decided. The processing hall was long and loud, echoing with languages layered over one another, the air thick with breath and damp wool. People were herded gently but firmly into lines that shifted without warning. Instructions were repeated, then contradicted, then repeated again. Brynhild waited. When her turn came, she stepped forward, papers ready, posture upright. The clerk glanced at her documents, frowned slightly, and attempted her name. Brynhild, he said, uncertain. She corrected him once. Calmly. He tried again. Failed. There was a pause, brief, but weighted. She recognized it immediately, the moment when a process might slow, when attention might sharpen. She intervened. Belle, she said. The word surprised her as it left her mouth. It was lighter, smoother. It traveled easily across the space between them. The clerk nodded with visible relief and wrote it down without comment. Belle. No one questioned it. No one asked what it replaced. Brynhild felt no sense of loss. Names, like clothing, were meant to suit circumstance. The old one had served its purpose. This one would serve the next. As she moved on, she repeated it silently. Tested its weight. Its sound. How it might look written by another hand. Belle. It required no explanation. Around her, others were less decisive. Arguments broke out. Tears followed. Some passengers clung to syllables as though they were proof of existence itself. Belle understood that proof worked differently here. What mattered was continuity, not origin. The name appeared again on a tag tied to her trunk, on a receipt, on a list pinned to a wall. Each repetition reinforced it. Each document made it harder to undo. By the time she left the hall, Belle felt anchored by the name rather than disguised by it. She did not think of this as deception. It was translation. Outside, the city pressed in immediately, noise, movement, density. Streets teemed with people who did not look at one another unless required to. Buildings rose in close, vertical lines that blocked sight and sound alike. Belle recognized the advantage at once. Here, anonymity was not absence. It was standard. She walked carefully, watching signs, following instructions exactly. She did not linger. Lingering invited attention. She carried herself with the quiet assurance of someone who believed she belonged where she was standing. By the end of the day, Brynhild no longer felt available to her. She had not been discarded so much as archived. Belle was current. She slept that night among strangers, her trunk at her feet, documents folded beneath her clothing. She dreamed not of Selbu, nor of her family, nor of the sea. She dreamed of lists. And of the power of being written down correctly. Chapter 8, Departure, 1881. The crossing was not heroic. That was the first correction Belle made to herself once the ship settled into its rhythm. There were no speeches, no sudden transformations. The ocean did not care who crossed it or why. It behaved according to its own rules, indifferent to expectation. Steerage was organized misery. Bodies were packed close enough to share breath and illness. Space was allotted precisely, without regard for comfort. Hammocks and bunks were assigned and reassigned as people failed inspections or were moved for reasons not explained. Privacy existed only in theory. Belle learned quickly how to make herself inconspicuous. She rose when required, ate what was given, followed instructions exactly. She did not complain, not because she was grateful, but because complaint altered nothing and drew attention. She watched instead. She observed how crew distinguished between passengers. Families were treated as units. Single men were tolerated. Single women were assessed, not overtly, but persistently. Eyes lingered. Questions repeated. Belle answered politely and briefly. She volunteered nothing. She learned the rhythms of the ship, when inspections occurred, when food was distributed, when the air below deck grew worst. She learned where to stand for fresher air without blocking passage. She learned when to sleep and when to remain alert. Illness spread predictably. Coughs moved through bunks in sequence. Fever followed weakness. Children succumbed first, then the elderly. The crew responded with efficiency rather than alarm. Bodies were removed quickly. Space was reassigned. Belle noted how little ceremony death required when distance intervened. She understood then that scale diminished significance. On land, death rearranged families. At sea, it rearranged bunks. She did not avert her eyes. Watching taught her what mattered. She noticed how people changed when they believed no one was keeping track. How manners softened, then disappeared. How desperation surfaced not in panic but in small thefts, bread tucked away, blankets claimed, places swapped. Belle guarded her belongings carefully. Her trunk remained locked. Her documents stayed on her person at all times, folded flat, protected from damp. Paper, she had learned, did not forgive carelessness. She spoke rarely, but when she did, she spoke clearly. Language shifted around her, Norwegian giving way to German, to English, to fragments she did not recognize. She listened for patterns rather than meaning. English, she noted, rewarded simplicity. She began practicing it quietly, repeating phrases under her breath. Statements rather than explanations. Short sentences. Declarative tone. On deck, when weather allowed, she watched the sea with detached interest. The vastness did not frighten her. It confirmed something she had already suspected, that the world was large enough to absorb disappearance without notice. She thought occasionally of Selbu, not with longing, but with assessment. Already it felt smaller, compressed by distance into a set of images rather than a place. Memory, she realized, obeyed scale as much as geography. As the voyage continued, she noticed a subtle shift within herself. Not relief, not anticipation, but insulation. Distance dulled obligation. She felt less accountable to the version of herself that had lived under her parents' roof, less bound to the expectations written into her name. She was no longer becoming something else. She was subtracting. By the time land appeared, first as a rumor, then as a certainty, Belle felt composed rather than exhilarated. The ship slowed. Orders were given. People gathered belongings with frantic energy. Belle waited until movement was required. When the dock finally received them, noise rushed in, whistles, shouting, machinery, language colliding with language. Officials waited with lists and instructions. The machinery of arrival began at once. Belle stepped forward when directed. She did not hesitate. She did not look back. The ocean closed behind her without ceremony. What lay ahead was not promise or threat. It was capacity. And Belle, standing on American ground in 1881, understood that capacity, once recognized, could be made to produce almost anything. Chapter 9. Marriage as Business. Belle did not think of marriage as a beginning. Beginnings announced themselves. They demanded witnesses and explanation. Marriage, as she encountered it in Chicago, was quieter than that. It slipped into life the way employment did, gradually, through repetition, until one day it simply existed and required maintenance. Mads Sorensen entered her days without drama. He was not striking, nor especially memorable. He spoke carefully, with pauses that suggested deliberation rather than doubt. He worked steadily. He paid what he owed. He believed that if a thing were done properly, papers signed, fees paid, rules observed, it would behave as promised. Belle noticed this immediately. He trusted systems. They met through mutual acquaintance, the way most people did in immigrant neighborhoods that overlapped by language and labor. There was no romance worth recording. No sudden devotion. Only familiarity, convenience, and the shared understanding that marriage stabilized things. Belle accepted his attention the way she accepted work, by assessing its utility. Marriage rearranged how others saw her. Landlords addressed her directly rather than around her. Shopkeepers extended small courtesies. Clerks answered questions instead of deflecting them. A woman alone was provisional. A married woman was established. Belle understood the distinction at once. Mads spoke often of saving, of responsibility, of foresight. These were not boasts. They were affirmations, statements he repeated to reassure himself that effort would be rewarded. Belle did not contradict him. She mirrored his seriousness. She spoke of the future in measured terms. She allowed him to feel prudent, sensible, deserving. This was not manipulation as she would later understand it. It was alignment. The wedding itself passed without incident. No spectacle. No extravagance. Belle wore a sensible dress. She smiled when required. She stood beside Mads with a composure people admired without quite noticing. What mattered was not the ceremony, but what followed. Domestic life settled quickly into routine. Mads worked. Belle managed. She kept the household efficient not out of pride, but because efficiency bred trust. Trust bred latitude. She noticed that men rarely guarded authority when they believed it was being reinforced rather than challenged. Mads allowed her to handle correspondence, to speak with landlords, to manage accounts. He praised her reliability to others, unaware that praise functioned as permission. Belle did not rush intimacy. She understood that closeness accelerated confidence, and confidence, acquired too quickly, could destabilize things. She let affection grow at a pace that felt natural to him. She observed how love blurred vigilance. At night, as Mads slept, Belle lay awake and listened, to the city, to the building, to the way privacy worked differently here than it had in Selbu. Walls were thin, but attention was thinner. People lived stacked upon one another and remained largely unknown. Anonymity, she realized, was not isolation. It was camouflage. She thought again of the church ledger in Selbu, not the names written there, but the fact that someone had chosen which details mattered. In Chicago, ledgers multiplied. Rent books, employment records, insurance documents. Each told a partial story. None of them spoke to one another unless required. This separation interested her. Mads mentioned insurance one evening as they ate. Not fearfully, but reverently. Protection against uncertainty. A way to ensure that effort was not wasted. Belle listened carefully. She did not think of death. She thought of continuity, of what remained after disruption, of how systems absorbed loss without altering their function. The idea felt familiar. Hunger's arithmetic, translated into a new language. Marriage, she understood, was not companionship. It was infrastructure. And infrastructure, once in place, made movement possible. When Belle later reflected on this period, she would not recall passion or happiness. She would recall clarity. Marriage had taught her how easily people mistook stability for goodness, and how willingly they trusted those who appeared to maintain it. Chapter 10. Insurance is a hymn. Marriage did not merely legitimize Belle. It enrolled her. Banks, insurers, landlords, doctors, each responded differently once a woman arrived bearing a husband's name and a steady address. Questions softened. Assumptions hardened. Processes that had once resisted her now opened with routine courtesy. With a husband, a woman became legible. Mads Sorensen was useful in this way before he was anything else. He trusted paperwork. He believed in saving, in preparation, in the notion that responsibility could tame misfortune if practiced diligently enough. He spoke of insurance the way other men spoke of faith, with repetition, with reassurance, with a quiet conviction that order existed and could be purchased in installments. Belle listened. She learned the cadence of his belief. How often the word appeared. How confidently he said it, as though speaking it aloud strengthened its effect. Insurance, she realized, was a hymn people sang to keep fear from coming too close. Domestic life continued smoothly. Belle handled the household without comment, not because she took pleasure in it, but because efficiency discouraged oversight. Bills were paid on time. Correspondence was filed neatly. Appointments were kept. Mads praised her organization to friends and acquaintances, proud of having chosen well. Belle allowed him the satisfaction. The first fire arrived without warning and without accusation. It began small, a fault, a spark, a mistake no one could quite identify. By the time neighbors noticed smoke, damage had already been done. Enough to force them out. Not enough to destroy everything. Belle responded precisely as expected. She wept. She clutched Mads's arm. She spoke of loss and gratitude in equal measure. What she did not do was panic. She noticed instead how quickly officials arrived. How sympathetically they spoke. How efficiently forms were produced and explained. The inspectors were professional, courteous, relieved to encounter compliance rather than resistance. They told Mads how fortunate he was to have insured properly. Belle watched how easily disaster translated into compensation when the sequence was correct. When the payout arrived, it felt less like relief than confirmation. Later, when Mads began to complain of headaches, persistent, unexplained, Belle shifted seamlessly into the role of caretaker. She monitored symptoms. She noted dates. She spoke clearly to doctors, neither exaggerating nor minimizing. She discovered that clarity encouraged trust. Illness rearranged authority quickly. Mads deferred more often now. He asked rather than assumed. He allowed Belle to manage appointments, payments, and correspondence. Insurance policies multiplied during this period, not dramatically, not suspiciously, but logically. Each addition was justified. Each explanation fit the story already in place. No one questioned a man protecting his family. Belle observed this closely. When Mads died, the city accepted the explanation with relief. Illness had preceded it. Symptoms had been observed. A doctor signed the necessary papers. Misfortune, everyone agreed, had struck again. Belle wore black. She received condolences. She did not faint or collapse. She cried when others were present and slept when they were not. Grief, she understood, required balance. The insurance payments arrived on schedule. This time, Belle felt something shift. Not triumph. Not joy. Understanding. Fire did not accuse. Illness did not testify. Paper did not remember emotion, only order. Belle had once believed money belonged to other people. Now she understood it belonged to systems. And systems, unlike people, could be learned. She did not yet think of herself as shaping outcomes. That language would come later. What she understood now was simpler, and more dangerous. If the world insisted on misfortune, it was possible to be prepared for it. If disaster was inevitable, it might as well be profitable. Insurance, she realized, was not protection. It was permission. Chapter 11. The Children Who Didn't Stay. Children disappeared differently from adults. Adults left behind paperwork, notices, causes that required explanation, even when the explanation was thin. An adult death disturbed the surface of things. It demanded response. Children left absences. They were small enough that their loss could be folded into routine. Illness, weakness, bad air, bad luck. The words moved easily through rooms without catching on furniture or conscience. Belle did not begin with intention. That was how she would later understand it, how she would later describe it to herself, if description ever became necessary. She began with acceptance. In Chicago, sickness was not an event. It was weather. Tenements held breath the way lungs held smoke. Coughs traveled through walls. Fever moved from room to room without invitation. Children weakened quickly. Everyone knew this. Everyone expected it. Belle watched other mothers learn the language of loss. She saw how their voices dropped, how they rehearsed the phrases that would be offered to them. God's will. Better off now. At least you have the others. She noticed something else as well. When a child died, attention followed the mother only briefly. Grief was permitted, but not prolonged. There were meals to cook, wages to earn, other children to mind. Loss, like everything else, was expected to be efficient. The first time illness took hold in her own household, Belle behaved exactly as she had been taught women ought to behave. She sat at the bedside. She wiped the mouth. She waited. She did not pray, not because she lacked belief, but because prayer implied negotiation. And Belle had learned early that the terms were never equal. When the child's breathing changed, she noticed immediately. She marked the moment without panic, without drama. She had always been good at recognizing thresholds, the instant when effort no longer altered outcome. Afterwards, neighbors came. They spoke softly. They shook their heads. They used gentle adjectives, as though gentleness itself might contribute something practical. Belle accepted their sympathy with precision. She did not exaggerate her sorrow. She did not minimize it. She allowed herself to be seen as appropriately wounded. She noticed how carefully people avoided looking at the body for too long. Death in children unsettled them. It suggested fragility they did not wish to examine too closely. There were costs. A small coffin. Time away from work. But there were also compensations. Insurance payments were modest, but they arrived cleanly. No delay. No questions. Belle learned then how smoothly money could pass through grief when the paperwork was correct. The second time, the pattern repeated, with variations small enough to seem natural. A different illness. A different season. The same outcome. Belle did not speak of coincidence. She spoke of weakness. Of the city air. Of fate. People nodded. These explanations fit comfortably inside what they already believed. By the third time, something in the atmosphere around her shifted, not accusation, not suspicion, but distance. Neighbors spoke kindly, but from a step farther away. Women stopped leaving their children alone with her, not because they thought her dangerous, but because her proximity to loss felt contagious. Belle understood the distinction. Fear required imagination. Distance required only discomfort. She adjusted. She became quieter, more contained. She asked for help only when necessary. She stopped speaking of the children except when prompted, and even then briefly. She noticed how memory weakened when there was nothing to anchor it. No photographs. No school records. No habits yet established. Children who died young did not accumulate evidence. Belle did not feel relief. Nor did she feel guilt in the manner novels would later insist upon. What she felt was alignment. The world behaved according to its rules. She behaved according to hers. What unsettled her most was not the deaths themselves, but how quickly they were absorbed into the city's ongoing noise. How readily conversations returned to rent, to work, to weather. She had once believed there were lines which, once crossed, altered a person irreversibly. Instead, life continued. The realization did not horrify her. It clarified her. When the insurance payments arrived, she folded the money carefully and placed it where money belonged. She did not linger over it. Lingering invited attention. She updated her internal ledger. She revised her understanding of what the world noticed, and what it did not. Children vanished quietly. Paper remained. And Belle, watching how easily absence settled into order, understood that disappearance was not chaos. It was a process. Chapter 12. Smoke teaches speed. Fire did not argue. It did not accuse or explain itself. It moved according to simple principles: heat, air, opportunity, and it rewarded those who understood how quickly those principles could compound. Belle learned this not through fear, but through repetition. The second fire came faster than the first. Not in its spread. Fire always spread at its own pace, but in the way Belle recognized what was happening and what it would require of her. There was no hesitation this time, no moment spent orienting herself to shock. She woke to pressure in the air before she smelled smoke. A wrongness that pressed against the skin. By the time the smell reached her, sharp, unmistakable, she was already moving. Mads coughed behind her. Confusion slowed him. Belle did not explain. Explanation cost time. She took his arm steady and firm, and guided him towards the door. Outside, neighbors gathered in various states of dress and alarm. Someone shouted. Someone cried. Someone ran for water that would not help. Belle wrapped herself in the expected responses. Fear. Gratitude. Shock. She let her voice tremble just enough to feel real. She clung to Mads as though she needed him to remain upright. Inside, the fire did what it had come to do. Later, after flames were beaten down, after officials arrived with their practiced solemnity, Belle moved through the aftermath with controlled efficiency. She stood where she was told to stand. She answered questions directly. She did not volunteer theories. She noticed how much smoother everything felt. She knew where to look, when to speak, when silence carried more authority. Inspectors examined charred beams and ruined furnishings, murmuring about faults and bad luck. Their attention lingered on damage, not on patterns. They spoke in shorthand, referencing stoves and wiring as though these explanations had been prepared in advance. Belle did not interrupt. She understood now that familiarity softened scrutiny. A second incident did not raise alarm, it reinforced a narrative. Some people, it was said, were simply unlucky. Misfortune, repeated, became character. When the claim was filed, Belle already knew how long it would take. She knew which receipts mattered and which could be estimated without challenge. She knew how sympathy compressed timelines. Speed, she learned, mattered more than precision. The first time, she had let the process teach her. The second time, she moved with it. Attention decayed quickly in a city trained by constant emergency. What moved fast enough escaped inspection. Mads praised her resilience. He spoke of her strength to others, repeating the word as though it explained everything. Belle accepted the praise without correction. His health continued to deteriorate. He tired easily now. Slept poorly. Complained of headaches that returned despite treatment. Doctors offered suggestions but no certainty. Stress, they said. Shock. Smoke inhalation. The body remembering what the mind wished to forget. Belle listened closely. She noted phrasing. She understood that language, once spoken by authority, became shelter. Another insurance policy was discussed during this period, framed as prudence rather than fear. A safeguard against unpredictability. Mads agreed readily. Preparation reassured him. Belle did not rush the decision. Rushed decisions attracted attention. Instead, she allowed the idea to return naturally, folded into conversation the way all sensible precautions were. Each addition fit the story already in place: a careful man, a competent wife, a household battered by circumstance but prepared. By the time Mads's condition worsened decisively, Belle was no longer reacting. She was managing sequence. Doctor. Paperwork. Notification. She noticed how calm encouraged cooperation. How clerks moved faster when not challenged. How officials preferred efficiency to inquiry. Grief followed expectation. Not too loud. Not too contained. She cried in public and slept in private. Accepted meals. Returned dishes promptly. People commented on her composure. They mistook it for strength. The insurance payments arrived with mechanical reliability. Belle no longer experienced them as surprise or relief. They were confirmations, proof that the system behaved predictably when approached correctly. Fire had taught her speed. Illness had taught her cover. Paper had taught her permanence. She did not think of herself as dangerous. Dangerous implied chaos, loss of control. What she felt instead was competence. The city did not punish competence. It rewarded it. Standing in the clean space where ruin had been, Belle understood something fundamental. Misfortune was not something to fear. It was something to manage. Smoke rose quickly. So did those who learned how to move with it. Chapter 13, Overlap Day. Belle learned the importance of dates the way other people learned the importance of faces. Faces altered. They aged, softened, hardened, disappeared. Dates stayed where you put them. They could be checked, aligned, made to agree. Properly arranged, they told a story that required no witnesses. She began keeping her own calendar, not the sort hung on a wall, but a ledger of intervals. Premium due dates. Grace periods. Renewal windows. The quiet space between one obligation ending and another beginning. What interested her most were overlaps. Mad spoke of policies as a careful man spoke of tools. Each one served a purpose. Each addressed a different risk. Fire. Illness. Accident. He liked the way the terms stacked together, how they suggested completeness. Belle noticed something else. Completeness produced redundancy. Redundancy produced opportunity. When Mads mentioned, almost casually, that two policies shared a date, only briefly, only in passing, Belle's attention sharpened. She did not react. She asked no immediate questions. She allowed the information to settle, testing it against what she already knew. She waited for another evening, another context, when the subject could return without effort. "Does it matter," she asked mildly, "that they're so close together?" Mads shrugged. "Better covered than not, I suppose." Better covered. Belle repeated the phrase silently. She imagined dates stacked like plates, one balanced precariously on the next. She imagined how little pressure it would take for several to fall at once. She did not imagine blood. She imagined paper. Overlap Day, the name she used privately, without ceremony, arrived without distinction. It was an ordinary weekday. Mads left for work later than usual, already tired. Belle tidied the apartment, moving through rooms with the ease of habit. She noted the time. She noted the weather. She noted how unremarkable everything felt. Ordinariness mattered. Extraordinary events invited questions. Ordinary ones dissolved into routine. Mads complained of a headache when he returned. He lay down. Belle brought him water. She sat nearby, not hovering, not distant. She had learned that proximity reassured even when it achieved nothing else. What followed did not feel inevitable. That was what remained clearest to her later. It felt contingent, dependent on small decisions, on whether she spoke or waited, on whether she called for help immediately or allowed time to work. She waited. When the doctor was summoned, Belle provided clear information. She did not dramatize symptoms. She did not minimize them. She allowed the situation to define itself. She noticed the doctor's relief at encountering cooperation rather than confusion, a composed wife rather than hysteria. Relief softened his questions. By evening, the outcome was no longer uncertain. Mads's body made its decision without consulting either of them. Belle sat with him as he slipped away, her hand steady, her breathing even. She felt no surge of triumph, no collapse of regret. What she felt was recognition. The system behaved exactly as it had been designed to behave. Afterwards, events unfolded with mechanical grace. Certificates signed. Notifications sent. Policies activated. Belle watched how the dates aligned on paper, how the overlap resolved itself into abundance. There was no confusion, no delay. Each policy acknowledged the others without contradiction. It was elegant. She wore mourning correctly. She spoke of Mads with respect. She described him as careful, prudent, a man who believed in preparation. People agreed. The story fit. No one asked whether preparation itself could be dangerous. As Belle sorted paperwork in the days that followed, something settled inside her, not a moral boundary crossed, but a hypothesis confirmed. It was possible to inhabit systems so completely that they could not distinguish intention from coincidence. It was possible to let the world perform the labor for you, provided you knew when to step aside. Overlap Day did not feel like a beginning. It felt like resolution. From that point forward, Belle would never again mistake chance for power. Chance was careless. Power kept records. Chapter 14, The Widow's Face. Widowhood did not arrive with grief. It arrived with permission. Belle learned this in fragments, through glances that lingered a fraction longer than courtesy required, through voices softened automatically, through the way clerks slowed their movements when she approached the counter dressed in black. The word itself carried weight. It explained things without demanding detail. Widow. It rearranged rooms. Belle wore it carefully. She dressed plainly, in mourning that was correct without being theatrical. Her hair was neat. Her posture upright. She did not lean on others physically, but she allowed herself to be guided conversationally, accepting advice she did not need, nodding as though it might one day prove useful. This, she understood, was the balance. Too much fragility invited control. Too much competence invited suspicion. She remained precisely between the two. People watched her more closely now, but not with accusation. With interest. They wanted to know how she was managing, whether she planned to return to family, whether she would stay in the city. They were not prying. They were assembling a narrative. Belle gave them one, piece by piece. She spoke of loneliness without despair, of uncertainty without panic. She described her future as open but sensible. She did not mention money unless asked, and even then, only vaguely. Security, she had learned, provoked resentment. When the insurance payments arrived, she received them privately. She did not celebrate. She did not alter her habits. She continued to live as though life were simply moving forward at a slower, heavier pace. People mistook restraint for sorrow. This suited her. Men treated her differently now. Their politeness acquired edges. Some were deferential, careful not to offend. Others were eager, their concern barely concealing calculation. A widow, Belle realized, represented possibility, a problem that might be solved. She studied them all. She no longer evaluated men for affection or attraction. She assessed them the way she assessed work, by reliability, by expectation, by what they demanded in exchange for what they offered. She noticed how quickly pity curdled into entitlement. Widowhood, she realized, made a woman visible in a particular way. Not desirable exactly, but available. Unclaimed. Temporarily unsupervised. Belle did not rush to be claimed. She took work selectively. She kept her accounts meticulously. She answered questions directly and without elaboration. She maintained her composure in public and her privacy in private. At night, she reviewed the weeks surrounding Mads's death with methodical distance. Not with regret or longing, but with analysis. She traced sequence again and again, searching for weakness, for moments that might have invited attention. She found none that troubled her. What occupied her thoughts instead was space. Chicago was dense, efficient, forgetful, but not entirely. Records accumulated. Stories overlapped. Coincidences compressed. She began to think about distance not as escape, but as leverage. Land, she knew, altered perception. Ownership conferred legitimacy. Isolation simplified narratives. She remembered Selbu's church ledger, the authority granted by names written cleanly and infrequently. She remembered how land anchored identity in ways people did not question. Widowhood had given her time. Money had given her choice. She began quietly to look beyond the city, to places where a woman could arrive with means and be received as respectable rather than curious. Places where accidents were explained by circumstance rather than pattern. Places where coincidence had room to breathe. Belle folded her mourning clothes carefully each evening, laying them out for the next day. She practiced the widow's face in the mirror, softened eyes, controlled mouth, a stillness that invited confidence without intimacy. It was not deception. It was fluency. And as she prepared to move again, Belle understood that the role she now inhabited was not an ending. It was a platform. Chapter 15, Buying Distance. Distance was not absence. Belle understood this as soon as she began to look beyond Chicago. Absence implied escape, flight, disorder. Distance implied intention, choice, a deliberate rearranging of circumstance. She did not leave the city suddenly. Sudden departures invited speculation. Instead, she gathered information the way she gathered everything else, quietly, through repetition. She asked questions that sounded casual. Which towns were growing? Where land could still be purchased outright? Which rail lines made travel possible without encouraging traffic? She listened to what people praised and, more importantly, what they dismissed. Dismissal often concealed opportunity. Rural places were spoken of indulgently, as though they were remnants rather than futures. Land was described as cheap, work as hard, life as simple. Simple appealed to her. In simplicity, there were fewer witnesses. Belle noticed that land changed the way people were regarded. Renters were evaluated. Owners were assumed. Ownership softened inquiry. It suggested stability, intention, permanence. She wanted permanence that could be moved. When she found the property in LaPorte County, it presented itself without flourish. A farmhouse. Outbuildings. Enough acreage to feel separate without feeling isolated. Close enough to town to transact business. Far enough away to control access. She walked the land carefully, measuring not beauty but function. Sight lines. Soil. Distance from neighbors. Where sound traveled. Where it did not. The house itself was unremarkable. That mattered. Remarkable houses were remembered. Belle liked the way the place sat back from the road, the way trees interrupted view without blocking it entirely. She noted how visitors would approach, visible for long enough to be accounted for, not long enough to be scrutinized. She imagined routines. Routines mattered more than structures. The transaction was straightforward. She paid in full. No mortgage. No lingering obligation that might invite oversight. The papers were signed cleanly. Her name was written clearly. Owner. The word felt different from widow. Owner implied authority without vulnerability. In town, her arrival caused little stir. A woman with money was noteworthy, but not alarming. A widow purchasing land was seen as sensible, even admirable. People praised her independence as though it were character rather than circumstance. Belle accepted the praise with modesty. She understood that modesty disguised confidence better than denial. She set about establishing herself deliberately. She attended church. She hired local men for occasional work, paying promptly and without complaint. She asked advice she did not need, then followed it selectively. She learned who talked and who watched, who exaggerated and who kept records. She learned which names carried weight and which merely filled space. The farm began to acquire a reputation before it acquired a history. Belle encouraged this. Reputation arrived faster than familiarity and was easier to shape. She made sure people saw her working. She spoke of improvement, of future plans. She mentioned loneliness once, carefully, allowing sympathy to do its work. Loneliness, she knew, attracted company. As the house settled into her possession, Belle took stock of what distance provided. Privacy, yes, but also control over narrative. Visitors arrived deliberately. Departures were noted but not tracked. The land absorbed sound, absorbed activity, absorbed explanation. Distance did not remove scrutiny. It thinned it. At night, Belle walked the property alone, noting where the ground softened, where water pooled, where earth gave easily beneath her boots. She observed the behavior of animals, the rhythm of seasons. She did not think of this as preparation. She thought of it as familiarity. Chicago had taught her density. Widowhood had taught her permission. Land taught her scale. She understood now that escalation did not require boldness. It required space. The farm gave her that. And standing there, alone on land she owned outright, Belle recognized something that felt almost like satisfaction. Not joy. Alignment. For the first time, environment and intention no longer resisted one another. They agreed. Chapter 16, A Second Husband, A Second Accident. Belle did not seek a husband. Seeking implied need. It suggested urgency, appetite, imbalance. What Belle required instead was inevitability, the sense that what occurred had simply arranged itself around her. She allowed proximity to do the work. In Lawport County, a woman living alone did not remain invisible for long. Neighbors noticed. Church members noticed. Men noticed most of all. Curiosity traveled easily along country roads. Belle made no effort to discourage it. She attended services regularly. She spoke politely. She accepted assistance when it was offered, declining only when refusal would appear strange. She did not flirt. She did not withdraw. She behaved as though companionship were incidental rather than desired. This unsettled people more than eagerness ever could. Peter Gunness arrived in her life as a solution rather than a seduction. He was solid, dependable, and accustomed to labor. A widower himself, with children, he carried grief as a familiar weight rather than a dramatic wound. They spoke first of practical things: land, animals, repairs. Belle listened closely. She noticed that Peter liked systems, but did not understand them deeply. He trusted processes he could see. He believed in effort more than foresight. This made him useful in a different way from Mads. The marriage followed without resistance. It made sense to others. Two widowed adults combining households, labor, and responsibility. It was efficient. Respectable. Belle understood the value of respectability on rural land. With Peter came children, not hers, but present. Belle absorbed them into routine without sentiment. She fed them, clothed them, managed their days. She did not pretend affection she did not feel, but she did not deny care either. Care was a function, not an emotion. Peter praised her organization. He trusted her quickly, relieved to hand authority to someone who appeared competent and calm. He deferred to her judgment without realizing he had done so. Trust, once given, rarely returned. Insurance entered conversation naturally. Peter had policies. Belle asked questions that sounded like concern rather than calculation. She encouraged what already existed. She framed preparation as responsibility. Peter agreed readily. He did not consider himself vulnerable. Men rarely did. He considered himself prudent. The accident came without spectacle. Peter left the house one morning for a routine errand. He did not return. When news arrived, sudden, violent, indisputable, Belle received it with composed disbelief. Shock without hysteria. Sorrow without collapse. The explanation required no embellishment. Accidents were common. Men worked. Men were injured. The countryside absorbed loss the way it absorbed weather. Belle observed how smoothly the narrative assembled itself. Widowhood returned to her, familiar and accommodating. The insurance process followed established pathways. Claims filed. Payments released. No questions that did not already carry answers. This time, however, something had changed. The repetition was visible. Not to everyone. Not immediately. But to those who had lived close enough to watch twice. Neighbors spoke kindly, but more cautiously now. Sympathy carried a note of discomfort. Some people began to use phrases like hard luck and poor woman with emphasis that lingered. Belle noticed. She adjusted. She spoke less. She appeared more subdued. She allowed others to guide conversation. She presented herself as overwhelmed, though never incapacitated. People preferred tragedy that humbled. She complied. The children were gone soon after, sent to relatives, absorbed elsewhere. Their absence was remarked upon briefly, then accepted. Rural life redistributed burdens efficiently. Belle watched how easily households reconfigured themselves around loss. She reviewed the sequence again privately, as she always did. She found no error, no deviation, no unnecessary exposure. And yet, she felt something new. Not fear. Pressure. Repetition compressed margin. What had once looked like coincidence now carried the faint outline of design. Belle understood this instinctively. Pattern did not emerge from intention. It emerged from visibility. She did not retreat. She refined. She understood now that land alone was not enough. That isolation required more than distance. It required control over who arrived, who stayed, and who was remembered. The farm could be more than property. It could be a filter. Standing at the edge of the land one evening, Watching light fade across ground she owned outright, Belle did not consider herself reckless. She considered herself experienced. She had learned what the world accepted. She had learned what it ignored. What remained was scale. And scale, she knew, would require new methods. Chapter 17, The Advertisement. The idea did not arrive as inspiration. It arrived as recognition. Belle had been reading the paper for weeks before she noticed what mattered. Not the headlines, those were repetitive and loud, but the smaller notices, tucked between announcements of sales and departures. Births. Engagements. Remittances sent home. Requests. They were written plainly, without ornament. A few lines. A name. A want. Belle read them the way she read ledgers. Not for sentiment, but for pattern. Men advertised themselves differently from women. They listed occupation, savings, seriousness. They framed marriage as an arrangement, not a romance. They wanted stability, respectability, a woman who could keep house and mind money. Loneliness appeared only indirectly, encoded in phrases like good character and desires companionship. Belle understood the language immediately. These were men who had already decided to leave something behind, a country, a family, a former life that no longer fit. Men who believed the next arrangement would correct the last. Men who traveled alone. She did not write an advertisement straight away. Premature action invited error. Instead, she collected examples. She noted phrasing, length, placement. She noticed which notices repeated, which disappeared after a single appearance. Disappearance interested her most. Some men advertised once and were answered quickly. Others returned again and again, their wording growing more urgent, less guarded. Belle tracked the progression carefully. Urgency, she noted, weakened judgment. When she finally composed her own notice, she did so with restraint. No extravagance. No desperation. She described herself as a widow, respectable, solvent, established. She mentioned land, livestock, security. She emphasized seriousness and intent. And she included one instruction, phrased gently, almost as an aside. Correspondents should be prepared to relocate and bring means sufficient to establish a household. She did not specify amount. Precision would have invited negotiation. Ambiguity encouraged overcompensation. When the advertisement appeared, responses arrived faster than she had anticipated. Letters came from men in nearby towns, then from further afield. Norway, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Dakotas. Many wrote in Norwegian. Some in careful English. A few attempted both. Belle read each letter twice. The first reading was for content, age, occupation, assets, temperament. The second was for tone, hesitation, boasting, deference, need. She learned to recognize patterns quickly. Men who wrote too much. Men who wrote too little. Men who mentioned money repeatedly. Men who apologized for having less than they wished. She preferred the last group. Apology suggested pliability. She responded selectively. Not every letter deserved reply. Silence functioned as filtration. Those who wrote again were noted, but not favored. Persistence suggested instability. Her replies were brief, courteous, encouraging without commitment. She confirmed details, asked practical questions, suggested a visit, and she included a second instruction, this one firmer. It would be best if you came alone. She framed it as propriety, as discretion, as efficiency. Most agreed readily. Travel, Belle understood, was itself a test. Men who could liquidate their affairs cleanly were preferable. Men who insisted on bringing companions were avoided. She encouraged correspondents to convert assets to cash. Livestock sold. Property settled. Bank drafts prepared. She never demanded it. She allowed them to conclude it was their own idea. When men arrived at the farm, Belle greeted them openly. She introduced them to neighbors. She spoke of marriage cautiously, of compatibility, of future plans. She offered food, work, routine. Routine mattered. Men who settled into routine stopped asking questions. Belle watched them carefully. How they ate, How they spoke of former lives. How they handled money. How they slept. She noted which men grew comfortable quickly and which remained alert. Alertness was inconvenient. Those men did not stay long. Departures were explained simply. Changed minds. Poor fit. Opportunity elsewhere. No one challenged this. Courtship was expected to fail occasionally. The farm absorbed comings and goings without comment. What mattered was that letters continued. The system refined itself. By the time Belle recognized the shape of what she had built, she no longer thought of it as deception. It was correspondence. Exchange. Selection. The advertisement had solved a problem she had not yet named. It brought men to her. It brought money with them. And it did so in a way that felt voluntary. Standing in the farmhouse one evening, sorting letters by lamplight, Belle did not feel exhilaration or fear. She felt order. For the first time, she was not reacting to circumstance. She was directing it. Chapter 18, Trunks in the Parlor. Men arrived with luggage. That was the first constant Belle noticed once the correspondence became routine. They arrived carrying more than clothes. Trunks were hauled in from wagons and trains, leather cases set down with care, parcels wrapped in oilcloth and string. Each object represented a decision already made. Leaving required commitment. Belle greeted each arrival at the door, as a hostess ought. She offered a meal, a place to wash, a chair by the stove. She spoke of travel fatigue and weather, of the road conditions from town. She did not rush them. Rushing unsettled people. The trunks were brought inside and placed in the parlor, usually near the wall where light was best. Men watched closely as Belle cleared space for them, as though the way she handled their possessions might reveal something essential about her intentions. She handled them carefully. Care built trust faster than kindness. She noticed how men arranged their belongings once unpacked. Some laid out clothes immediately, claiming space. Others kept everything contained, opening trunks only when necessary. The latter group watched more closely. She preferred men who spread themselves out. Money appeared early, though rarely all at once. Some men produced cash almost immediately, eager to demonstrate seriousness. Others mentioned it indirectly, speaking of bank drafts or funds held elsewhere. Belle responded to each approach with equal calm. She never counted money in front of them. Counting was private work. Instead, she acknowledged it briefly, then moved conversation on. She understood that men wanted their resources noticed, but not scrutinized. Respect was assumed when discretion was maintained. The farm accommodated them easily. There was always work to be done. Repairs. Feeding. Clearing. Men settled into usefulness quickly, grateful for structure after the dislocation of travel. Routine softened edges. Belle made sure neighbors saw the visitors. She introduced them by name. She spoke of courtship in general terms, of possibilities rather than promises. She allowed the community to register presence without forming attachment. Attachment complicated absence. When men asked how long they would stay, Belle answered honestly. "We will see," she said. Most accepted this. Those who did not revealed themselves quickly. She observed habits closely. Who drank too much. Who slept heavily. Who spoke of family left behind with bitterness or relief. Who asked questions about the land, the neighbors, the boundaries. Questions mattered. Men who asked about boundaries were thinking ahead. She encouraged comfort. Full meals. Familiar tasks. Evenings spent talking by lamplight. She spoke of her losses with restraint, of her hopes with moderation. She allowed men to imagine themselves as solutions. The trunks remained in the parlor. They became part of the room's furniture, leaned against walls, stepped around without comment. Their presence normalized the idea of arrival, of settlement. Each one carried a history that had already been condensed into objects. When a man left, and some did, his belongings left with him. The absence registered briefly, then faded. Courtship, people understood, did not always succeed. But not all departures were witnessed. Some trunks remained longer than their owners. Belle moved them eventually, but never immediately. Immediate action invited notice. Instead, she allowed time to dull specificity. After a while, even she could not have said precisely how many trunks belonged to whom. Memory required reinforcement. Without it, details blurred. When she finally opened the trunks alone, she did so methodically. She inventoried contents without emotion. Clothes, papers, personal items, cash hidden in linings or false bottoms. Men hid money predictably. She folded clothing neatly. She stacked documents. She removed identifying marks carefully, separating what could be reused from what could not. She did not keep keepsakes. Keepsakes implied attachment. What remained after sorting was reduced, simplified, transformed. Items were sold in town, distributed quietly, or stored away. Nothing was discarded thoughtlessly. Waste was inefficient. The parlor returned to its original state between arrivals. Clean, orderly, ready. Belle understood then that the room functioned as a threshold. A space between intention and outcome. A place where lives paused briefly before rearranging themselves. The normalization happened without ceremony. Men came. Men settled. Men disappeared. The farm absorbed it. So did the town. As Belle stood in the parlor one evening, lamplight falling across an empty patch of floor where a trunk had stood only days earlier, she did not feel triumph. She felt confirmation. The system held. And as long as it did, she understood, the world would continue to mistake absence for accident. Chapter 19. Bring only cash. The instruction appeared gradually. Belle did not include it in her earliest letters. Early insistence would have sounded grasping, or worse, anxious. Instead, she allowed the idea to surface naturally, introduced as practicality rather than demand. Travel was expensive, she wrote. Farms required capital. It was easier, she explained, to begin together if assets were simplified before arrival. Men understood this language. Many had already converted portions of their lives into portable form, selling tools, livestock, small parcels of land. Cash represented freedom to them. It meant they were unencumbered. Ready. Belle reinforced the belief gently. It will save trouble later, she wrote. It is simpler this way. We can decide together once you are here. Together was an important word. It softened instruction. It suggested partnership rather than surrender. Men responded predictably. Those with means complied readily, sometimes proudly. They described the sums they had raised, the cleverness of their arrangements. They spoke of drafts and notes, of money safely folded and hidden. Belle read these passages carefully. Men who itemized their funds tended to watch them closely. Men who mentioned amounts once, then moved on, trusted systems rather than vigilance. She preferred the latter. As correspondence continued, Belle refined her language. Letters became shorter, more direct. She stopped explaining herself. Explanation implied doubt. Bring only cash, she wrote eventually, without ornament. Not all at once. Not in every letter. But often enough that the phrase settled into expectation. Men rarely questioned it. Those who did revealed themselves quickly. Some asked about banks. About safekeeping. About records. Belle reassured them without specificity. She spoke of local arrangements, of discretion, of privacy. Privacy appealed to men who already felt themselves diminished by distance and age. She also noticed who hesitated. Hesitation did not disqualify a man immediately, but it placed him lower in consideration. Hesitant men asked follow-up questions. They required reassurance. They noticed inconsistencies. Belle learned to redirect such men gently, to delay meetings, to cool correspondence, to allow interest to wither without confrontation. Selection improved with repetition. The men who arrived now came better prepared. Fewer trunks. More compact belongings. Money carried on the body rather than stored with possessions. They arrived expecting to hand control over gradually. Belle accommodated this expectation. She did not demand immediate access to funds. Demands invited resistance. Instead, she allowed men to speak of their money themselves. To offer it. To frame it as commitment. She accepted with measured gratitude. Money changed behavior almost immediately. Men who had arrived guarded relaxed. Their posture softened. Their sleep deepened. They worked harder, spoke less, assumed permanence. Assumption was useful. Belle stored money carefully. She divided it, hid portions in different places. She did not trust a single location or method. Redundancy mattered. She also learned to anticipate regret. Men sometimes mentioned money they had not brought, accounts left behind, funds entrusted to relatives. Belle listened without comment. Regret surfaced late, usually when familiarity made honesty feel safe. She noted such admissions. They informed future letters. Over time, the instruction hardened into rule. Men arrived alone. Men arrived liquid. Men arrived untraceable. Belle no longer thought of this as cruelty. It was optimization. She had learned what survived scrutiny and what dissolved into explanation. She had learned how little the world demanded if offered coherence. Cash left no trail unless someone went looking. And no one, she understood, went looking for men who had already announced their intention to disappear into marriage. The instruction did not alarm the town. It did not alarm the neighbors. It did not even alarm most of the men who complied. It sounded sensible. It sounded prudent. It sounded like the language of starting over. Standing at the desk one evening, letters sorted neatly into piles, answered, unanswered, discarded, Belle recognized the shift fully. She was no longer responding to opportunity. She was manufacturing it. The phrase "bring only cash" was not merely instruction. It was filtration. And filtration, once perfected, allowed systems to scale. Chapter 20, The Hired Man. Belle did not hire Ray Lamphere because she trusted him. She hired him because he was useful. Ray arrived without the confidence of the men who came by letter. He did not bring a trunk. He brought a small bag and an unsettled air, the sort that made people step aside without being able to say why. He spoke too quickly, then fell silent without warning. His eyes darted, then fixed, as though he were searching for something that might appear if he stared hard enough. Belle noticed all of this immediately. Unstable people, she had learned, obeyed different rules. They were not reliable, but they were predictable in their unpredictability. They filled space noisily. They drew attention without direction. And when attention gathered around them, it did not gather elsewhere. Ray needed work. He said this plainly, repeatedly. He had lost positions before. He blamed others for it. Employers, he claimed, misunderstood him. Towns had turned against him. He spoke of grievance the way other men spoke of weather, as something constant, unavoidable. Belle did not contradict him. She offered board and wages. She outlined tasks simply. Feeding animals. Repairs. Odd jobs that required effort rather than precision. Ray accepted immediately. He worked hard at first, driven by urgency rather than discipline. He tired quickly. His moods shifted without warning. Some days he spoke incessantly, others he withdrew entirely, hovering at the edges of rooms like an afterthought. Belle observed how the neighbors reacted to him. They noticed Ray quickly. They commented on his manner. They speculated. His presence altered the farm's atmosphere, lending it a note of disorder that Belle herself did not possess. This, she recognized, had value. Ray became a fixture. He slept in the outbuildings, ate separately, when possible, drifted in and out of the farmhouse without ceremony. He asked questions at inappropriate moments and forgot answers just as quickly. He watched Belle with an intensity that was not quite admiration and not quite suspicion. She managed him carefully. She gave him just enough information to make him feel included. She withheld enough to prevent understanding. She allowed him to believe he was indispensable while ensuring he remained peripheral. He saw arrivals. He saw departures. He noticed trunks moved, rooms repurposed, routines altered. But Ray did not assemble patterns. Pattern required stability. Ray possessed none. Belle understood that people like Ray were believed selectively. Their accounts were discounted before they were even heard. Their credibility eroded itself through excess. This made him dangerous in theory and harmless in practice. Occasionally, Ray asked about the men who came and went. They didn't suit, Belle said simply. Ray nodded, satisfied by explanation alone. At times, his attention lingered. He would mention a name incorrectly, or recall an object that should have been forgotten. Belle corrected him gently or ignored him entirely, depending on which response diminished his confidence most. She noticed that Ray responded poorly to confrontation but well to dismissal. He wanted acknowledgement, not truth. As the system continued, Ray's presence became part of its camouflage. Visitors registered him as evidence of disorder. A hired man who drank, who talked, who made mistakes. Disorder reassured people. It suggested chaos rather than design. Belle allowed Ray to believe he knew more than he did. Knowledge, misapplied, became noise. Noise obscured signal. She also recognized risk. Ray spoke when anxious. He spoke to neighbors. He embellished. He hinted. But his hints were inconsistent. His stories contradicted themselves. People listened with curiosity, then with skepticism, then not at all. Belle never reprimanded him publicly. Public reprimand created sympathy. Instead, she corrected him privately, calmly, reminding him of his position, his dependence, his instability. She framed her authority as patience. Ray resented this and relied on it simultaneously. The arrangement held. But Belle understood something had changed. For the first time, there was someone on the farm who did not arrive by letter, who did not leave by design, and who could not be fully predicted. Control now included management of another will. Standing in the yard one evening, watching Ray move aimlessly between tasks, Belle acknowledged the cost. Scale required labor. Labor introduced witnesses. Witnesses required distortion. Ray Lamphere, she realized, would never be silent. But silence was not always necessary. Sometimes, being unbelievable was enough. Chapter 21, The Neighbor's Unease. Unease arrived before suspicion. Belle recognized this difference instinctively. Suspicion required shape, a charge, a theory, a narrative strong enough to repeat aloud. Unease was quieter. It lingered without direction. It changed behavior without announcing itself. In LaPorte County, people were accustomed to minding their own affairs. Farms sat apart. Lives intersected briefly, then separated again. Privacy was not celebrated, but it was respected. Belle had counted on this. What she had not fully accounted for was familiarity. Neighbors noticed patterns not because they were looking for them, but because repetition made noticing unavoidable. Men came to the farm. Men worked. Men left, or were said to leave. Over time, the explanations blurred. Courtship failed. Engagements dissolved. Plans changed. These were reasonable stories. But reason did not always settle discomfort. The first signs were small. A neighbor hesitated before returning a greeting. A conversation ended sooner than expected. Invitations arrived less frequently. Belle adjusted her behavior in response. She smiled more often. Spoke less. Attended church regularly, sitting in the same pew each week. Consistency reassured people. Still, the feeling persisted. One neighbor in particular, a woman whose land bordered Belle's, began to watch more closely. Not openly, not rudely. She noticed arrivals and departures. She noticed how often Belle walked the property alone at dusk. She noticed Ray. Ray unsettled her. He unsettled most people. He spoke too freely and too vaguely at the same time. He hinted at things without naming them. He contradicted himself. His presence lent the farm a sense of imbalance that Belle herself never displayed. The neighbor mentioned him to others. Strange fellow, she said. Unsettled. Others agreed readily. Agreement required no risk. When Ray spoke of men who had come and gone, the neighbor listened with polite skepticism. She nodded without commitment. She filed his words away without granting them weight. People believed what fit. What did not fit was stored without conclusion. Belle noticed the neighbor's attention and responded with openness. She invited her in occasionally. Offered coffee. Spoke of loneliness. Of how hard it was to manage a place alone. The neighbor softened. Loneliness explained much. Yet unease remained. It surfaced in indirect questions. Do you hear from him still? Did he ever write? Funny how some men just vanish. Belle answered calmly. Without irritation. Without elaboration. They change their minds, she said. People do. Not everyone wants the same thing. These were statements people recognized as true. What Belle understood was that unease did not need resolution to persist. It merely needed reinforcement. Each unanswered question added weight. Each coincidence stacked itself quietly atop the last. She could not eliminate it. She could only diffuse it. She began to stagger arrivals more carefully, to space departures, to ensure neighbors saw letters arrive and be read. She spoke aloud about plans that would never occur. Anticipation distracted from absence. She also allowed Ray to remain visible. His disorder reassured people that if anything were wrong, it would be obvious, loud, chaotic, uncontained. Danger, people believed, announced itself. Belle did not. The neighbors' unease never matured into action. There was nothing to act on. No body. No accusation. No formal complaint that would not sound foolish once spoken. But it did not fade either. It lingered, dormant but alert. Belle understood this was the cost of scale. Systems attracted friction. She accepted it. Standing at the edge of the property one afternoon, watching the neighbor move along her own fence line, Belle did not feel threatened. She felt measured. Unease, she knew, was not an enemy. It was a signal. And signals could be managed, so long as they were detected early enough. Chapter 22. A brother goes looking. Unease could linger indefinitely. Inquiry could not. Belle understood the difference the moment the letter arrived. It was not written in the cautious tone of a man hedging his hopes, nor in the inflated optimism of courtship. It was direct. Spare. It asked questions that did not soften themselves in the asking. It was signed by a brother. Andrew Helgelian had not written to propose marriage or to apologize for delay. He wrote because his brother had stopped writing altogether, and silence, when it followed regular correspondence, carried weight. Belle read the letter once, then again. It did not accuse. Accusation required confidence. It asked instead for reassurance. When had Andrew last been seen? What were his plans? Had he spoken of returning? Belle recognized the tactic immediately. Concern framed as courtesy. She replied promptly. Delay invited escalation. She wrote calmly, kindly. She explained that Andrew had stayed briefly, that he had spoken of opportunities elsewhere, that he had left in good spirits. She expressed regret that she could not offer more certainty. I too expected to hear from him, she wrote. Perhaps he will write to you soon. She sealed the letter carefully and sent it on its way. The response came sooner than she expected. The brother did not accept uncertainty easily. He wrote again, this time with more detail. Dates, amounts, references to money Andrew had liquidated before leaving. He asked whether Belle knew where his brother had banked, whether he had mentioned drafts or notes. The questions were precise. Belle adjusted her replies accordingly. She confirmed what she could without extending herself. She deflected what she could not without contradiction. She reiterated that Andrew had been independent, decisive, eager to begin anew. Men disappeared often, she implied. It was not an unusual thing. But the letters did not stop. They multiplied. Other names appeared in the margins, friends, cousins, associates who had expected Andrew's return or at least his word. The correspondence took on a density Belle had not encountered before. This was not curiosity. It was pursuit. Belle considered her options carefully. She could ignore the letters, but silence now would read differently than it had before. She could write less, but brevity invited inference. She could write more, but detail created surface area. She chose steadiness. Each reply was measured. Each detail consistent. She repeated phrasing deliberately, allowing repetition to reinforce plausibility. Still, the pressure increased. One letter mentioned travel. The brother was considering coming to La Porte himself. Belle read that line several times, feeling the shift fully then. Distance had collapsed. She had relied on the assumption that men who traveled alone were functionally untraceable, that their disappearance would be absorbed by geography, by time, by the expectation that reinvention required silence. She had not accounted for devotion. Devotion rearranged priorities. It justified expense. It sustained effort. Belle responded immediately, discouraging the visit without refusing it outright. She spoke of inconvenience, of the difficulty of rural travel, of how little she could offer in the way of new information. She appealed to practicality. It did not work. When Andrew Helgelian's brother arrived in Lockport County, he did not arrive as an investigator. He arrived as a family member unwilling to accept abstraction. Belle received him politely. She did not hide. She did not prevaricate. She greeted him as she greeted all visitors, with openness calibrated to circumstance. He asked to see the farm. She obliged. He walked the property slowly, attentively. He noticed details others overlooked, where the ground dipped, where paths were worn, where routines left their mark. He asked questions without raising his voice. Did he mention this? Was he here long? Did he seem worried about money? Belle answered each one calmly. Andrew had been content. Andrew had been hopeful. Andrew had spoken of leaving for opportunities elsewhere. The brother listened without interruption. He did not argue. That troubled her more than accusation would have. When he left, he did so politely, thanking her for her time. He did not say he was satisfied. Belle watched him go, understanding that something fundamental had shifted. This was no longer a matter of community unease or unreliable witnesses. This was persistence with purpose. Family did not fade. Family remembered. That evening, Belle reviewed her system with sharper scrutiny than she had before. She noted where assumptions had replaced verification, where patterns had been allowed to accelerate without reinforcement. The system still held. But it was under observation now. And observation, unlike suspicion, did not require consensus. It required patience. Belle understood then that escalation had consequences beyond repetition. Scale attracted attention. And attention, once focused, rarely looked away on its own. Chapter 23, A Watch That Doesn't Come Home. Objects behaved differently from people. People could change their minds. They could alter their stories, relocate, fall silent. Objects persisted. They remained where they were placed, carrying use, wear, and intention without interpretation. They did not forget. Belle had learned this early. She had relied on it, even, counting on the fact that most objects dissolved into usefulness once removed from context. The watch did not. It was mentioned first in a letter. Not dramatically, not as accusation, but as detail. Andrew Helgelian's brother asked whether Belle recalled a watch his brother always wore, silver, solid, a recent purchase, insured separately. The specificity mattered. Belle replied that she did not remember it. This was true in the narrow sense. She did not remember the watch as an object worth distinguishing at the time. Men arrived with watches often enough. They took them off for work. They set them down. Timepieces were common. But common things became uncommon once they were named. The brother wrote again. He described the watch more carefully. He noted that Andrew had written of it shortly before traveling. He included the serial number, copied from a policy. Numbers anchored memory. Belle felt the shift immediately. This was no longer an inquiry that could be diffused with generalities. A serial number implied traceability. It suggested records beyond letters and recollection. She reviewed her own habits carefully. Watches were usually removed before work. Hung on nails. Set on shelves. Collected later. They were small enough to be overlooked in the movement of days. This one, however, had not returned to circulation. Belle searched the house methodically. Drawers. Boxes. The places she kept items temporarily before deciding what to do with them. She checked her records. Her lists. The watch did not appear. That absence concerned her more than its presence would have. An object that vanished entirely invited questions. An object that lingered invited explanation. She considered whether it might already have been sold, traded, discarded without note. She found no confirmation. The brother arrived again, this time with more resolve. He asked to see Andrew's belongings, if any remained. He spoke of personal effects. Of closure. Belle agreed. Refusal would have read as concealment. She presented what she had, clothing that could plausibly have been left behind briefly, items without identifying marks, things that suggested transition rather than permanence. The brother examined them carefully. He did not rush. He touched fabric, checked pockets, lifted seams. He noticed the absence. His watch, he said finally. He never went anywhere without it. Belle maintained her composure. "He may have taken it with him," she said. "He spoke of leaving soon." The brother did not argue. He asked instead about Ray. Ray, called in and questioned, responded predictably. He spoke too much. He contradicted himself. He remembered things incorrectly, then corrected himself with unnecessary elaboration. He mentioned seeing Andrew work without his watch once. Or perhaps it was another man. He could not be certain. His uncertainty undermined him entirely. The brother listened, then thanked Ray politely and dismissed him. Ray left the room agitated, resentful. Belle watched the exchange with careful attention. The brother's method was becoming clear. He was not searching for confession. He was narrowing improbability. Each missing object, each inconsistency, each gap in routine added weight. The watch was no longer just a possession. It was an anchor, a thing that should have traveled with its owner and had not. Belle understood the danger of anchors. They fixed stories in place. In the days that followed, Belle noticed changes in how people behaved around her. The brother spoke with neighbors, asked questions, compared notes. He did not accuse, but he did not accept reassurance either. The watch circulated in conversation now. Did he ever mention it? Did you see him wearing it? Funny thing to leave behind. Objects, once named, multiplied witnesses. Belle adjusted her responses accordingly. She spoke of forgetfulness, of men setting things aside, of the way habits broke during travel. All plausible, none definitive. But the watch did not reappear. And because it did not, it began to acquire meaning disproportionate to its size. Belle understood then that investigation did not require certainty to advance. It required friction. The watch created that. It refused to resolve. And as long as it remained unresolved, it kept the past from closing cleanly. Standing alone that night, Belle reviewed her system with a sharper eye than before. She noted where objects lingered too long, where sorting had been delayed, where familiarity had replaced caution. The system still functioned, but it had developed edges. Edges cut. And Belle recognized with measured clarity that the farm was no longer merely absorbing absence. It was beginning to retain it. Chapter 24, The Hog Lot. The land had always been cooperative. That was what unsettled them first. When the men arrived, neighbors, officials, the brother, they expected resistance. Dense earth. Hard digging. A landscape that pushed back against intrusion. Instead, the ground gave easily, the soil dark and loose, as though it had been turned often enough to remember the shape of disturbance. Belle watched without comment. She did not hover. Hovering suggested anxiety. She stood where she was expected to stand, hands folded, posture neutral, offering neither assistance nor objection. She behaved as a property owner being inconvenienced rather than a woman being examined. The hog lot was not chosen at random. Animals left marks. They churned soil. They erased impressions. They created a plausible explanation for irregular ground, for bones, for fragments that might otherwise demand context. Investigators understood this immediately. They began carefully, methodically, marking sections, pacing distances. This was not yet an accusation. It was a response to persistence, to letters unanswered by resolution, to objects that had failed to return home. The first shovel broke the surface cleanly. No stone. No root. Just earth. Belle noted how quickly the mood shifted. How conversation dropped away. How men leaned in without meaning to. Digging invited attention in a way talk never did. The smell came next. It was not dramatic. Not overpowering. It rose slowly, unmistakable once recognized, carrying with it the particular weight of something that had not been meant to surface again. One of the men stopped digging. Another continued, faster now. The first bone appeared without ceremony. Small. Pale. Unmistakable. A pause followed, brief, collective. This was the moment Belle had anticipated for months, though she had never named it directly. The moment when narrative yielded to matter. When explanation could no longer outrun evidence. The digging continued. Fragments accumulated. A jaw. A length of femur. Buttons, corroded but intact enough to suggest clothing once arranged around a body. Metal that caught the light, not the watch, but enough to confirm pattern. Each find narrowed possibility. The brother stood apart, silent, his attention fixed not on Belle but on the ground itself. This was not triumph. It was confirmation, the heavy, irrevocable kind that arrived without relief. Officials began to speak in lower voices. Instructions were given. The area expanded. Stakes were placed. Notes taken. This was no longer a courtesy visit. It was a sight. Belle felt the shift distinctly. Not fear, fear scattered thought, but recalibration. She understood that the system had reached its limit. Scale had finally exceeded camouflage. She considered flight briefly. Not in panic, but as calculation. Distance had served her before. But distance required time, and time had collapsed. The land that had absorbed absence so efficiently was now returning it, piece by piece. She remained where she was. Movement now would be read as guilt. Stillness, at least, could be explained. As the afternoon wore on, the count increased. The ground gave up what it had held. Each fragment made denial less tenable, yet still incomplete. There were no full bodies. No immediate totals. Ambiguity lingered. Even now, certainty resisted. Belle observed how officials spoke cautiously, how they avoided numbers, how they framed findings as possible, suggestive, under review. Language strained to keep pace with what the earth was producing. She understood this instinctively. Institutions moved carefully when scale threatened to overwhelm procedure. The hogs were removed. The lot was cordoned. Attention spread outward, to the cellar, the outbuildings, the house itself. Belle was escorted inside, not restrained, but contained. Offered a chair. Water. Polite distance. She accepted each without comment. In the house, familiar spaces were re-seen as potential archives. Floorboards were examined. Walls tapped. Measurements taken. The farm was no longer neutral. It was evidentiary. By evening, word had spread beyond LaPorte County. Journalists arrived. Neighbors gathered at a distance. The property filled with bodies that did not belong to Belle. Control had shifted decisively. And yet, even now, what unsettled investigators most was not the quantity of remains, but the absence of immediacy. Time had passed. Soil had done its work. Proof would be slow, incomplete, vulnerable to dispute. Belle understood this too. Even exposed systems retained inertia. As she sat under observation, the sounds of digging carrying faintly through open windows, Belle did not think of escape or confession. She thought of timing, of what remained uncertain, of how much the ground could say, and how much it would never be able to say at all. The whole glot had opened, but it had not yet finished speaking. Chapter 25, Counting Without Names. The coroner arrived with boxes. Not instruments of revelation, but of order, labels, envelopes, ruled paper, twine. Procedure did not begin with answers. It began with containment. With deciding what belonged to what, and how much could be said with certainty. The remains were laid out on boards beneath a temporary shelter. Each fragment was handled separately, lifted with care that bordered on apology. Bones were cleaned only enough to distinguish surface from soil. No attempt was made to reconstruct whole bodies. Reconstruction implied confidence they did not yet possess. This was cataloging, not conclusion. Each item received a number. The numbers did not correspond to people. They corresponded to finds. A femur here. Teeth there. Buttons clustered near a patch of darker earth. Metal warped by time and pressure. The coroner spoke quietly as he worked, explaining more for the benefit of record than for those listening. He described age ranges, possible sex, indications of trauma that could not yet be confirmed. He avoided definitive language. Definitive language collapsed later. Human, he said often. Consistent with. Cannot exclude. Belle listened from where she was seated, guarded but not restrained. The language was familiar to her. It mirrored the phrasing she had relied upon, possibility without assertion, implication without commitment. She understood why institutions spoke this way. Precision was protection. The coroner did not look at her often. When he did, his gaze was neutral. This was not yet an encounter between accuser and accused. It was an encounter between evidence and process. He asked questions only when necessary. How long had the hogs been kept there? Had the ground been disturbed for any reason other than feeding and fencing? Were there previous owners of the property? Belle answered evenly. The hogs had been there years. The ground was always being turned. She had owned the land outright since purchase. Each answer was recorded, not challenged. The remains were grouped by proximity rather than assumption. This was deliberate. Bones found together might not belong together. Time collapsed difference. Animals redistributed matter. Fire and soil altered shape. Nothing was presumed. The coroner examined teeth carefully. Dental work was noted, but identification through dentistry required comparison, and comparison required records that might not exist. Many of the men who had come through Belle's letters had left countries where dental charts were rare, incomplete, or inaccessible. Identity resisted retrieval. Clothing fragments were treated as artifacts rather than evidence of personhood. Fabric rotted unevenly. Buttons endured. Belt buckles survived longest of all. Metal told stories flesh could not. One small object, not the watch but a chain, was isolated and bagged. It would be cleaned later, compared to letters, descriptions, policies. It might belong to someone. It might belong to no one. The coroner made no promises. As the day wore on, the count increased, not of bodies but of items. The distinction mattered. Newspapers would not honor it. Officials would. By evening, a provisional report was prepared. It did not accuse. It did not name. It described multiple sets of human remains, advanced decomposition, evidence consistent with long-term burial. The wording was cautious to the point of austerity. Belle recognized the gap this created, the space between public imagination and procedural restraint. She had lived in that space for years. But she also understood something had changed. Once the coroner recorded the remains, they could not be unrecorded. Each number, each bag, each line of description fixed absence into institutional memory. The system had accepted the burden. Later, when Belle was informed that further examination would follow, that remains would be transported, that specialists might be consulted, she acknowledged the information with a nod. She asked one question. How long will it take? The coroner did not answer immediately. As long as it requires, he said finally. That answer carried weight. Procedure moved slowly, but it did not stop. As night settled over the farm, lanterns marking the dig sites like subdued stars, Belle understood the final shift with clarity. The investigation no longer needed her cooperation to continue. It had materials now. Counting without names was only the beginning. Names, when they came, would follow their own timetable, and bring with them obligations that even the most carefully constructed system could not easily absorb. Chapter 26. The press learns a number. The number did not come from the coroner. It emerged indirectly, as numbers often did, assembled from fragments, approximations, and repetition. A reporter overheard a phrase. A clerk misremembered a count. Someone spoke too freely about multiple sets, and someone else translated that into a figure that sounded definitive. Procedure did not produce numbers quickly. Procedure resisted them. The coroner's office worked in stages. Remains were transported under seal, logged at departure and arrival, transferred to clean tables in rooms designed for patients rather than spectacle. Each fragment retained its identifier. Each bag carried its own paper trail. Nothing was combined without justification. Bones were laid out in sequence not to build bodies, but to identify duplication. Two left femurs did not make one person. They made uncertainty. The work was subtractive rather than additive, eliminating what could not belong together before suggesting what might. Age estimates were broad. Sex determinations cautious. Trauma assessment was constrained by condition. Fire altered surfaces. Soil obscured edges. Animals rearranged evidence without intention. The coroner noted all of this in measured language. Indeterminate appeared often. Soil damage cannot be excluded. Post-mortem disturbance likely. Each phrase slowed inference. The press did not wait. Outside the office, numbers circulated without context. 10, 12, 15. Each iteration hardened slightly as it passed from mouth to mouth. Precision accumulated not from evidence, but from repetition. Inside, procedure continued. Comparative analysis began with what could be verified. Missing persons reports were requested. Letters were reviewed. Descriptions cross-checked against recovered artifacts. A belt buckle matched a description in one letter. A button style aligned with a particular manufacturer and period. These were correlations, not conclusions. The watch was still absent. That absence mattered more now. An object described precisely and insured formally should have left a trace. Its failure to appear narrowed possibilities in ways the bones alone could not. The coroner documented this carefully, without inference. Item reported missing, not recovered among effects or remains. Language that neither accused nor absolved. Transport records were compiled. Soil samples preserved. Notes taken on depth, layering, and disturbance. Depth suggested time, but time remained elastic. Hog activity blurred chronology. Fire altered markers. Specialists were consulted. Opinions solicited, then qualified. No one wanted to be the first to say too much. Procedure favored restraint. Meanwhile, the number grew. Each day it was repeated, it gained authority. Newspapers preferred roundness. At least a dozen became as many as 20. The figure detached from its origin and began to live independently. Inside the system, the coroner resisted it. He did not correct the press directly. Correction implied engagement. Engagement invited distortion. Instead, he issued statements that refused enumeration. Multiple individuals. Number not yet determined. Identification ongoing. These statements slowed nothing. Belle was informed of each procedural development as required. She was moved between locations according to schedule. She was neither interrogated continuously nor ignored. The system treated her as it treated the evidence, with methodical caution. She listened to the numbers through walls, through the voices of guards and clerks who did not realize they were carrying them. She noted how quickly numbers replaced names in conversation. People spoke of totals before they spoke of individuals. Procedure did the opposite. The divergence widened. By the time the first formal report was drafted, the public narrative had already outrun it. The report contained no final count. It described conditions, limitations, next steps. It emphasized uncertainty. The press described certainty. This did not trouble the coroner as much as it might have troubled others. He understood that procedure and narrative served different functions. One sought accuracy. The other sought coherence. They rarely converged cleanly. What mattered now was that the system had accepted responsibility for continuation. Evidence was in custody. Records were being built. Each day added thickness to the file, weight to the archive. Numbers would change. Procedure would not. And as the gap between them widened, Belle understood something essential. Once an investigation acquired momentum independent of proof, it no longer required precision to persist. It required only continuity. The system had that now. Whether it would ever fully close was another matter entirely. Chapter 27, Transport and Chain. Once the remains left the farm, they entered a different jurisdiction. This was not a transfer of authority so much as a multiplication of it. Each movement required documentation. Each handoff generated record. What had begun as local inquiry now unfolded across offices that did not share walls, or assumptions, or tolerance for improvisation. Chain of custody became the governing principle. Every item, bone, fragment, object, was logged again upon arrival. The identifiers assigned at the farm were checked against transport manifests. Discrepancies, however minor, were noted. A number smudged. A label creased. Nothing was dismissed. Procedure assumed error before malice. The remains were stored separately, not by presumed individual but by recovery zone. This preserved context, even when context itself was degraded. The coroner insisted on this structure despite pressure to accelerate identification. Acceleration invited mistake. Laboratory examination followed sequence. Cleaning was minimal and documented. Measurements were taken twice, by different hands, and compared. Notes were annealed. Dates recorded. The work was slow. Teeth were examined under magnification. Fillings were catalogued. Where patterns assessed. These details mattered because they were comparative, useful only if something existed elsewhere to compare them to. Often, nothing did. Many of the men who had come to Belle's farm had lived without formal medical records. They had crossed borders, changed names, left paper behind deliberately. The system had to work around absence rather than through it. This was not unusual. It was merely inconvenient. Soil samples were analyzed next. Depth, composition, layering. Hog disturbance complicated interpretation, but it did not erase it entirely. Stratification suggested sequence, if not exact dates. The coroner noted this cautiously. Burial events likely occurred over an extended period. Not simultaneous. Not single incident. Extended period implied pattern. That implication was recorded without elaboration. Parallel to the lab work, correspondence expanded. Agencies were contacted. Notices sent. Missing persons lists compiled and cross-referenced. Letters from families were received and logged. Some were hopeful. Some accusatory. Most were desperate for certainty rather than justice. Each letter was answered formally. Procedure required acknowledgement, not reassurance. Belle was questioned again during this period, but the tone had shifted. Interviews were now structured. Questions followed prepared outlines. Answers were recorded verbatim. She noticed the change immediately. This was no longer conversational. It was archival. She responded as she always had, clearly, calmly, without embellishment. She did not speculate. She did not volunteer. Speculation contaminated record. The officials conducting the interviews did not challenge her directly. Direct challenge implied theory, and theory was premature. Instead, they focused on consistency. Dates. Names. Movements. Consistency mattered more than confession. Where Belle's answers aligned with earlier statements, notes were made. Where they did not, those discrepancies were flagged without confrontation. Flags accumulated quietly. The watch remained unresolved. Its absence was noted in every summary. Each time it appeared, it was phrased identically. This mattered. Repetition hardened absence into fact. Personal item reported, not recovered. By the end of the week, the file had grown thick enough to resist easy handling. New sections were added. Tabs inserted. Indexes drafted. The system had committed. Commitment changed everything. Investigations failed often. They stalled. They dissolved into uncertainty. But once they accumulated enough paper, they developed inertia. Files did not like to be abandoned. As the remains continued to be examined and the correspondence continued to arrive, the work moved forward without urgency but without pause. Procedure did not rush. It advanced. And Belle, observing the steady accretion of record, understood that whatever happened next would not depend on a single discovery or confession. It would depend on accumulation. The same principle she had relied upon for years. Only now, it was being applied to her. Chapter 28, The Question of Fire. Fire entered the record late. Not because it had been overlooked, but because it belonged to a different file. Insurance claims were archived separately from missing persons reports. Death certificates were indexed by cause. Property loss followed its own administrative logic. Systems rarely spoke to one another unless instructed to do so. The instruction came quietly. A clerk, cross-referencing dates at the request of an investigator, noticed repetition. Not in outcome, fires were common enough, but in structure. Multiple claims. Similar timelines. Similar phrasing in statements. A widow present each time, composed, cooperative, consistent. The observation was noted in the margin. That was all it took. The insurance files were retrieved from storage and laid out alongside the coroner's materials. Not to accuse, but to compare. Comparison was permitted. Accusation was not. The first step was chronology. Dates were aligned without interpretation. Fire incidents listed against property records. Claims matched to policy activation dates. Adjuster notes reviewed for language rather than conclusion. Words mattered. Accidental. Cause undetermined. No evidence of negligence. These phrases appeared repeatedly. Investigators did not dispute them. They treated them as artifacts of process rather than truth claims. Each had been correct within its own moment, based on the information available then. The question was not whether any one fire had been suspicious. It was whether repetition altered meaning. Patterns were mapped cautiously. A timeline was drawn, stripped of narrative. Fire, illness, death, claim, move, fire again. The sequence did not prove intent, but it did suggest opportunity. The insurance policies themselves were examined next. Coverage amounts, beneficiaries, amendments, additions made shortly before incidents. None were irregular in isolation. Together, they formed a profile of diligence that bordered on prescience. This, too, was noted without judgment. The investigators were careful not to retroactively criminalize prudence. Many people insured thoroughly. Many people experienced misfortune. The difference lay not in preparation, but in frequency. A second clerk was assigned to review adjuster correspondence. Tone was analyzed. Belle's statements were compared across incidents. Consistency was striking. Descriptions of shock varied within narrow bounds. Gratitude was expressed similarly each time. No detail exceeded necessity. No speculation appeared. Adjusters had responded favorably to this. They had recorded her as reliable, composed, credible. Credibility, the investigators understood, was not evidence of innocence. It was evidence of performance. Still, performance alone did not constitute crime. The fire records were therefore not integrated into the main file immediately. They were appended, referenced, flagged for future correlation. Procedure required restraint. What changed, however, was orientation. Investigators no longer treated the fires as background misfortune. They became potential context, a lens through which other events might be re-examined. The whole glot had produced remains. The correspondence had produced absence. The fire records produced repetition. None alone was sufficient. Together, they suggested structure. A separate memorandum was drafted, careful in its phrasing. Consideration of prior fire-related insurance claims may be relevant to broader pattern analysis. No accusation. No conclusion. Just relevance. Belle was not questioned about the fires again immediately. That would have been premature. Premature questioning invited rehearsed answers. The investigators preferred to understand the file fully before re-entering dialogue. They allowed the records to speak first. As the files grew thicker and the timelines more dense, one fact became unavoidable. What had once appeared as discrete episodes now resisted separation. The system, having been instructed to look sideways rather than forward, had begun to recognize itself. And once systems recognized one another, isolation ended. Fire had not destroyed evidence. It had delayed conversation. That delay was now over. Chapter 29, Consolidation. Consolidation did not occur in a single meeting. It unfolded through memoranda. Files were not merged physically at first. They were linked conceptually, referenced across margins, indexed by hand, flagged with paper slips that altered how each document was approached. A fire report now carried a coroner's case number in pencil. A missing persons letter gained an insurance file reference. These were small acts with lasting effect. Jurisdiction complicated matters. Local authorities retained control of immediate findings. State offices oversaw forensic analysis. Insurance companies guarded their own records, bound by confidentiality but responsive to formal request. Requests multiplied. Each one followed protocol. Each one generated response time. The pace was deliberate, designed to withstand scrutiny rather than satisfy curiosity. A coordination memo was drafted to establish scope. It outlined 3 parallel streams: forensic findings, remains, artifacts, soil analysis, timelines, correspondence and disappearance, letters, arrivals, absences, family inquiries, financial and property records, insurance claims, policy changes, asset transfers. The memo did not propose causation. It proposed overlap. Overlap justified consolidation. Once approved, a central index was created. This was the practical heart of the process. Names were listed alongside aliases and variations. Dates were standardized. Locations fixed. Each entry was cross-referenced to multiple sources where possible. Gaps were marked explicitly. Absence was documented as such, not filled with assumption. Investigators assigned to the consolidated file were instructed to avoid theory building. Their task was correlation, to identify where independent records described the same event without knowing it. This produced results quickly. A policy amendment coincided with a visit. A letter ceased shortly after arrival. A fire claim followed a move. None of this was new information. What was new was proximity. Once placed alongside one another, the records lost the insulation that time and bureaucracy had provided. Events previously understood as isolated now sat within reach of comparison. The system began to speak. Meetings were held to review findings, but they were brief and structured. Each participant reported only what their documents supported. Speculation was discouraged. Questions were deferred. The aim was to produce a file that could be read forward without commentary and still suggest direction. That aim was met. By the end of consolidation, the file had achieved a quality investigators recognized instinctively. It did not accuse. It did not persuade. It insisted. Insistence emerged from density, from repetition, from the way multiple independent records described outcomes that aligned too closely to remain incidental. Belle's name appeared throughout, consistently spelled, consistently placed. Her statements remained internally coherent. That coherence now stood in contrast to the disorder accumulating around it. Consistency, once protective, became conspicuous. The watch's absence was revisited within the consolidated context. It now intersected with financial documentation, correspondence timelines, and artifact recovery logs. Still absent. Still unresolved. But now undeniably relevant. A formal recommendation was issued to advance the case from inquiry to charge consideration. The language remained cautious. Evidence suggests sufficient grounds to proceed. Sufficient was a procedural word. It meant not complete, not perfect, but adequate to move forward without violating standard. The recommendation triggered new obligations. Legal consultation. Evidence review for admissibility. Witness assessment. Ray Lamphere's statements were re-evaluated within this framework. His unreliability was acknowledged. His proximity was not dismissed. Witnesses did not need to be credible in isolation. They needed to be contextual. Belle was notified of the change in status formally. The notice was brief. Informational. It outlined no accusations. It cited procedural steps. She acknowledged receipt. Consolidation had accomplished what digging alone could not. It had transformed a series of troubling discoveries into a coherent institutional object, one that could be transferred, argued, and acted upon. From this point forward, the case no longer depended on uncovering new evidence. It depended on whether what already existed could be made to stand. Chapter 30, Preparation for Charge. Preparation did not begin with accusation. It began with subtraction. Prosecutors reviewed the consolidated file not to add meaning, but to remove vulnerability. Each document was tested for admissibility. Each statement was examined for how it had been obtained, recorded, and preserved. The question was not what happened, but what could be proved without inviting collapse. Proof was a discipline. The first step was to identify a viable theory that could survive procedure. Not a comprehensive account. Comprehensive accounts invited dispute, but a narrow pathway through the material that required the fewest assumptions. This narrowed the field immediately. Some findings were set aside. Not because they were irrelevant, but because they were fragile. Bones without identification. Artifacts without provenance. Numbers that could not be defended under cross-examination. These were retained in the file, but not foreground. The prosecutorial team focused instead on points of convergence that did not rely on interpretation, correspondence that established invitation, financial records that showed transfer, witness testimony that placed individuals at the property, and physical evidence that established unlawful disposal of human remains on land under Belle's control. Control mattered. Ownership mattered. The charge would not be built on motive. Motive complicated matters. It invited psychology, speculation, narrative, all things defense counsel could exploit. It would be built on responsibility. Who controlled the land? Who invited the men? Who benefited financially? Who remained when others did not? The coroner's findings were framed carefully. Prosecutors worked with what the report stated, not what they implied. Language was preserved verbatim. Qualifications were retained. Consistent with remained consistent with. Cannot exclude remained cannot exclude. This discipline was deliberate. Overstatement risked reversal. Witness lists were refined. Some names were removed despite relevance. Reliability was weighed against necessity. Ray Lamphere remained on the list, but his role was constrained. He would not be asked to interpret events, only to place himself, Belle, and others in proximity. Context, not credibility, would carry his testimony. The brothers' statements were treated differently. His correspondence established pattern without embellishment. His visit fixed timeline. His missing watch anchored expectation. The watch itself remained absent, but its documentation did not. Absence could be argued. The prosecution also prepared for inevitable challenge. Defense counsel would argue hysteria. They would argue media contamination. They would argue coincidence amplified by rural superstition and public appetite. To counter this, the prosecutors emphasized procedure. They prepared demonstratives that showed sequence without commentary, charts that aligned dates, tables that matched letters to arrivals, maps that showed ownership and access. Nothing dramatic, nothing rhetorical. The aim was inevitability. A preliminary brief was assembled for judicial review. It did not name crimes theatrically. It listed proposed charges in measured language, grounded in statute rather than story. Unlawful disposal of bodies. Fraud-related offenses connected to inducement and benefit. Conspiracy, where applicable. Each charge was accompanied by a summary of evidence that supported it and an acknowledgement of its limitations. Limitations were not weakness. They were protection. Belle was informed again, this time with specificity. She was advised of representation rights, of upcoming proceedings, of the nature of the allegations under consideration. She received the information without visible reaction. This, too, was noted. The prosecutors did not interpret her demeanor. They had learned to distrust interpretation. They confined themselves to record. By the end of preparation, the file had changed character. It was no longer investigative. It was propositional. It proposed that a case existed sufficient to place before a court. Not sufficient to resolve all uncertainty, but sufficient to compel response. That threshold mattered more than certainty. The system did not require omniscience. It required enough. And by the standards it applied to itself, enough had been assembled. Chapter 31, Arraignment. Arraignment reduced the case to its barest elements. Names were spoken. Charges read. Dates fixed. Everything else, the years, the land, the letters, the bones, receded into the background. Procedure preferred compression. It stripped complexity to determine whether the machinery could move forward at all. Belle was brought into the courtroom under routine escort. There was no spectacle in her arrival. No restraints beyond what policy required. She was placed where defendants were placed and left there to wait. Waiting was integral to the process. The courtroom itself was unremarkable. Wood worn smooth by repetition. Benches polished by use rather than care. The space existed to absorb people briefly, then release them altered in status if not in substance. The clerk called the case. Belle stood when instructed. She gave her name. The pronunciation was corrected once, then accepted. The correction was entered into the record. The charges were read slowly, each one framed by statute rather than narrative. The language was precise, impersonal, and cumulative. Unlawful disposal of human remains. Fraudulent inducement under false pretenses. Associated financial offenses. No adjectives. No totals. No speculation. Each charge carried its own evidentiary burden. Together, they suggested scope without declaring it. Belle was asked how she pleaded. Not guilty, she said. The words were neither defiant nor subdued. They were appropriately timed, clearly spoken, and immediately recorded. No further comment was permitted or required. The judge confirmed counsel. Bail was addressed next, not as judgment but as logistics. Arguments were made regarding flight risk, community concern, the seriousness of the allegations. The prosecution spoke in procedural terms. Ownership of land. Pattern of inducement. Potential access to funds. Risk, they argued, was not speculative. The defense countered with stability. Property ownership. Community ties. Absence of prior conviction. The argument was equally procedural. Belle remained silent. Silence functioned differently here. It was no longer interpretive. It was mandated. The judge ruled without commentary beyond necessity. Conditions were set. Dates scheduled. Instructions issued regarding disclosure and preservation of evidence. The gavel struck. Arraignment concluded. Nothing had been decided. And yet, everything had changed. From this point forward, the case existed in two parallel forms. One, the public proceeding, dates, motions, appearances. The other, the evidentiary engine, disclosures exchanged, challenges prepared, vulnerabilities identified. Belle was returned to custody or supervision according to the order issued. The movement was routine, almost administrative. The system did not dramatize its own actions. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited. Inside, files were closed and reopened elsewhere. The next stage began without announcement. What mattered now was not discovery, but endurance. Procedure would grind forward, indifferent to coherence, indifferent to sentiment. It would ask only whether the materials assembled could withstand opposition. Belle had built her life on systems that rewarded patience, restraint, and control of sequence. She now faced one that demanded the same. Only this time, she was not the one directing it. Chapter 32, Disclosure. Disclosure did not reveal truth. It revealed vulnerability. The prosecution's obligation was not to persuade at this stage, but to surrender control, to place its materials into the hands of those whose task was to dismantle them. Every document, every note, every photograph, every statement that might be relied upon had to be catalogued, copied, and delivered according to rule. The file changed hands without changing shape. Defense counsel received the disclosure in parts. Not because of strategy, but because of volume. Boxes were numbered. Contents indexed. A schedule was prepared to track what had been provided and when. Nothing was left informal. The prosecution's index was precise to the point of austerity. Each item was listed with source, date, and relevance. Qualifications were retained. Uncertainties preserved. The defense began where they always did. Chain of custody was examined first. Each transfer of remains, each movement of artifacts, each handoff between offices was traced. Not for dramatic breaks, but for minor deviations. A signature slightly out of order. A date corrected after entry. A seal replaced. None of these alone invalidated evidence. Together, they suggested fragility. Expert reports were read with particular care. The defense did not dispute conclusions immediately. They scrutinized language. Consistent with. Likely. Cannot exclude. These phrases were circled, highlighted, annotated. Each represented a door that could be opened later. The absence of complete bodies was noted repeatedly. Fragmentation complicated attribution. Soil disturbance introduced doubt. Time blurred sequence. Doubt was the defense's currency. Witness statements were compared against one another. Ray Lamphere's accounts received special attention. His contradictions were mapped, not to discredit him entirely, but to constrain him. His unreliability could be weaponized selectively, dismissed when inconvenient, invoked when useful. The brother's statements were treated differently. His consistency worked against him in some respects. Defense counsel questioned memory. Emotional investment. Retrospective certainty. None of this was confrontational yet. It was preparatory. Financial records were reviewed next. Defense counsel acknowledged the existence of funds, of transfers, of insurance claims. They did not dispute legality in isolation. They framed prudence as virtue. Preparation as common sense. They began to assemble an alternative narrative without stating it outright. A widow. An investor. A woman repeatedly struck by misfortune. The prosecution anticipated this and prepared accordingly. They identified points where coincidence strained credibility, where frequency exceeded baseline, where benefit followed too reliably to remain neutral. But they did not argue yet. Disclosure was not argument. It was exposure. Belle was informed of the process in general terms. She was not present for most of it. She did not need to be. Her counsel relayed developments selectively, focusing on procedural posture rather than content. This, too, was deliberate. Defendants were not helped by knowing everything. As disclosure continued, motions began to take shape in outline. Suppression. Exclusion. Limitation. Each would target a specific vulnerability revealed by the materials. The court scheduled deadlines. Dates were set. The pace was regulated. Procedure asserted itself again. What emerged from disclosure was not clarity, but contour. The shape of the case became visible, not its outcome, but its stresses. Where it would bend. Where it might break. Both sides adjusted accordingly. The prosecution refined its theory further, narrowing focus to what could survive erosion. The defense sharpened its tools, identifying where pressure might produce collapse. Belle's role during this phase was minimal and absolute. She waited. Waiting was no longer passive. It was required. Chapter 33 Motions. Motions were where the case was reduced to what could survive contact with rule. They were filed without ceremony, stacked neatly, paginated, indexed. Each motion represented an attempt not to win, but to exclude. The court was not interested in what the case might mean. It was interested in what it was permitted to hear. The defense moved first, as expected. They challenged scope. Not the existence of remains, but their attribution. Fragmentation, they argued, rendered identity speculative. Soil disturbance compromised chronology. Animal activity destroyed sequence. What could not be dated reliably could not be placed, and what could not be placed could not be charged coherently. They did not deny death. They denied assignment. Next came numbers. The defense argued that any reference to totals, suggested or implied, was inherently prejudicial. The jury, they warned, would mistake repetition for proof. Estimates assembled from press reporting, hearsay, or inference must be excluded entirely. The prosecution conceded partially. They withdrew reference to specific counts beyond those tied to identifiable remains. This concession narrowed the narrative dramatically. The case would no longer imply magnitude. It would rely on responsibility. Ray Lamphere's testimony was addressed next. The defense did not seek its full exclusion. That would have suggested fear. Instead, they requested limitation. Ray's statements, they argued, were inconsistent, emotionally unstable, and shaped by proximity to investigation. He could place himself on the property. He could describe routine. He could not be permitted to interpret events. The prosecution agreed to constraint, not exclusion. Ray would testify to presence, not conclusion. This too reduced scope. Financial records followed. The defense argued that insurance claims and cash transfers were lawful acts and could not be introduced as evidence of wrongdoing without proof of fraud at inception. Prudence, they reminded the court, was not a crime. The prosecution responded carefully. They did not argue motive. They argued sequence. They framed the financial records not as proof of intent, but as context for opportunity. The judge reserved decision. Hearings were conducted over several days. They were technical and unspectacular. Lawyers spoke in conditional clauses. Judges interrupted not to debate morality, but to clarify admissibility. What does this show? How is this connected? Is this inference or fact? Language tightened with each exchange. Rulings were issued incrementally, often orally, sometimes in writing. Some evidence was admitted with restriction. Some was excluded entirely. Certain phrases were barred. Certain exhibits could be shown but not explained. By the end of motions, the case had changed shape. It was no longer expansive. It was no longer cumulative. It no longer gestured toward totality. It focused instead on a narrow corridor of provable responsibility, that human remains were unlawfully disposed of on land Belle controlled, that men had been induced to arrive under representations that ended in disappearance, that benefit followed absence with sufficient regularity to justify charge. Everything else, speculation, magnitude, narrative, was stripped away. This was not weakness. This was survival. The court did not require a story. It required a structure that could withstand challenge. When the final motion was ruled upon, silence followed, not dramatic, but procedural. Dates were set. Instructions issued. Counsel adjusted strategy in real time. The case would proceed. But it would proceed smaller than anyone had imagined at the beginning. And in that reduction lay its final form. The system, having absorbed years of activity, retained only what it could legally carry forward. What could not be carried was not denied. It was simply left behind. Chapter 34. What could be said? Trials were not investigations. That distinction mattered, though it was rarely understood outside the courtroom. Investigations moved outward, gathering material wherever it could be found. Trials moved inward. They contracted. They selected. They reduced. By the time proceedings formally began, most of the case no longer existed. Years of activity had been pared down to admissible fragments. Statements had been trimmed of context. Objects stripped of biography. What remained were items that could be spoken aloud without inviting collapse. The court did not ask what Belle had done. It asked what could be said about what she had done, under oath, within rule, without inference that could not be defended. Belle sat through the proceedings as a fixed point in a moving structure. She was present, but increasingly abstracted, referred to rather than addressed, described rather than engaged. She was no longer a person in the narrative sense. She was a position. Witnesses spoke cautiously. Each had been instructed, rehearsed, constrained. They avoided adjectives. They avoided speculation. When asked questions that invited expansion, they answered narrowly or deferred. I don't recall. I cannot say. That would be speculation. The prosecution resisted drama. They had learned that drama weakened cases like this. Instead, they presented sequence: letters sent, arrivals logged, property controlled, remains recovered. Sequence did not require motive. Sequence required only time. The defense worked equally carefully, not to replace one story with another, but to erode certainty at the edges. They pointed to gaps, to missing objects, to assumptions that could not be formalized. They did not claim innocence. They claimed limitation. Throughout it all, the jury listened to a case that felt smaller than the one they had encountered outside the courtroom. There were no totals. No sweeping declarations. No language that gestured toward enormity. The judge reinforced this daily. You are not to consider what you may have read. You are not to infer beyond the evidence presented. You are not to speculate. Speculation was the enemy of procedure. The watch was mentioned again, still absent, still unresolved. Its absence was allowed to stand as fact, not conclusion. The jury was instructed accordingly. They were asked to decide not what must have happened, but what could reasonably be established. This distinction reshaped everything. Outside, Belle had become a figure of accumulation, of bodies, of numbers, of horror multiplied until it could no longer be held in language. Inside, she remained bounded. The court did not deny the larger story. It simply could not carry it. Belle's demeanor was noted but not interpreted. She did not testify. Her silence was procedural, not symbolic. The court instructed the jury explicitly that silence could not be read as implication. Silence here meant nothing. The prosecution rested without flourish. The defense followed suit. Closing arguments reiterated constraint rather than conviction. This case is not about legend, the prosecution said carefully. It is about responsibility. The defense echoed the narrowing. This court cannot punish suspicion, they replied. Only proof. When the jury retired, the courtroom emptied slowly. Papers were gathered. Exhibits returned to custody. The case entered its final waiting period, not for discovery, but for decision. Belle was led away without ceremony. Nothing about the moment suggested resolution. What the trial had accomplished was not explanation, but containment. It had drawn a boundary around what the system could formally recognize and pushed everything else outside it. That remainder, the unspoken, the unprovable, the excessive, did not vanish. It simply ceased to matter here. And Belle, who had built her life on understanding what systems would carry and what they would discard, recognized the result with clarity. This was not vindication. Nor was it exposure. It was the final articulation of limit. The truth, whatever it was in its entirety, exceeded the court's capacity to hold it. And so the court did what it was designed to do. It said only what it could. Chapter 35, Residue. Resolution was a word the system used sparingly. What followed the trial did not feel like an ending so much as a settling, matter sinking into place once motion ceased. Files were closed, not because they were complete, but because they had reached a state the institution recognized as sufficient. Sufficiency was not truth. It was stability. The verdict, whatever its precise articulation, did not absorb the whole of Belle's life. It absorbed only what had been made portable. What had survived rule, relevance, and restraint. The rest remained outside the frame. Remains were reinterred without full naming. Where identification was possible, it was done quietly, documented in appendices rather than announced. Where it was not, numbers stood in for people, and procedures substituted for ceremony. Families received letters composed with care. The language avoided promise. It avoided apology. It acknowledged loss without attempting to account for it. Closure was not offered. Information was. Some families accepted this. Others did not. The system did not respond differently to either. The farm changed hands. Surveyors came. Boundaries were remarked. Outbuildings were dismantled. The hog lot was leveled, the earth smoothed until it resumed the appearance of ground that had always been there. Land, given time, learned how to look innocent. New owners altered the house. Walls were repainted. Floors sanded. Rooms repurposed. Each change erased a little more specificity, until memory could no longer anchor itself to place without effort. Belle's name persisted longest. It remained attached to files, to indexes, to cross-references that outlived the urgency that created them. In institutional memory, she existed as an entry, consistent, legible, unresolved at the edges. The public version of Belle did not resemble this. Outside the system, her story inflated. Numbers grew. Motives hardened. Certainty flourished where the court had refused it. She became a figure of appetite and enormity, a receptacle for fear and fascination that exceeded documentation. Inside the system, none of that mattered. What mattered was that the process had concluded within its own rules. The trial had not explained Belle. It had defined what could be said about her. And that definition, narrow, procedural, incomplete, was the final act of the system's authority. It drew a line between what could be proven and what would remain conjecture. Belle understood this outcome better than most. She had lived by the same principle for years, that what could not be carried forward by structure would dissolve, regardless of how vivid it felt to those who remembered it. She had relied on that limit. Now it enclosed her. Residue remained. It always did. In archives. In unanswered letters. In objects that never returned home. The system did not remove residue. It catalogued it. And then, having done so, it moved on. Epilogue, what the record cannot hold. The historical record prefers clarity. It arranges lives into sequences that make sense after the fact, smoothing contingency into inevitability. In the case of Belle Gunness, that impulse has been particularly strong. She has been rendered monstrous because monstrosity explains scale. It relieves the record of having to explain process. This book has resisted that relief. The surviving documents do not reveal a singular motive, nor a consistent psychology that resolves into certainty. They reveal something less dramatic and more troubling, a woman who understood institutions early and thoroughly, who learned what they rewarded and what they discarded, and who acted within those margins until the margins collapsed. The gaps in the record are not failures of research. They are features of the system that produced it. Many of the men who vanished left little behind by design. They traveled alone. They converted lives into cash. They stepped willingly into arrangements that promised reinvention and delivered silence. The system did not notice their absence quickly because it was structured not to. When it finally did, it responded not with revelation but with method. What remains are fragments, bones without names, letters without replies, objects without owners. These are not mysteries awaiting solution so much as evidence of limit. They mark the point at which narrative desire exceeds procedural capacity. Belle Gunness persists not because she is fully known, but because she is not. She occupies the space between what can be proven and what must be imagined. Each retelling attempts to close that space. None succeeds entirely. That failure is instructive. It reminds us that institutions are powerful not because they see everything, but because they decide what counts. They do not resolve history. They stabilize it. And in that stabilization, something is always left behind. This book leaves it there. Not as absolution. Not as condemnation. But as record. Bibliography. Primary sources, contemporary to the events. Indiana State Coroner's Office. Lawport County Coroner's Inquest Records, 1908. Archival files, fragment inventories, and procedural summaries. Lawport County Sheriff's Office. Investigation files relating to Belle Gunness. Depositions, warrants, correspondence, and evidence logs. Trial transcripts. State of Indiana versus Belle Gunness. Pre-trial motions, arraignment records, and courtroom proceedings. Insurance company records, various. Fire loss claims, policy amendments, adjuster reports, and correspondence relating to properties owned by Belle Gunness and her husbands. Contemporary newspapers, 1903 to 1910. Chicago American, Indianapolis Star, Lawport Herald, Minneapolis Journal. Reporting, editorials, and public notices consulted for contemporaneous framing rather than factual certainty. Secondary sources, historical and analytical. The Strange Case of Belle Gunness. New York, Berkeley Books. A foundational narrative account, used cautiously for chronology and cultural context rather than evidentiary certainty. Hell's Princess. New York, Simon & Schuster. Consulted for synthesis of sources, claims cross-checked against primary material. Female serial killers. Academic compilations on gender, crime, and institutional response. The Anatomy of Motive. Referenced indirectly to understand the limits and pitfalls of retroactive psychological profiling. Academic journals on legal procedure and forensic anthropology. Used to ground descriptions of coroner practice, evidentiary thresholds, and the handling of fragmented remains in early 20th century contexts. Archival note. This work is grounded in the procedural record, not in retrospective certainty. The historical archive surrounding Belle Gunness is extensive but uneven. It contains abundant commentary, repetition, and conjecture, alongside significant gaps where documentation either never existed or was never preserved. Many individuals associated with the case left minimal formal records by circumstance or choice. Their absence from the archive is not an oversight, it is an historical condition. Where possible, this narrative privileges primary documentation over later synthesis, procedural language over interpretive speculation, consistency across records rather than singular dramatic claims. Where sources conflict, the conflict itself has been preserved rather than resolved narratively. Silence, absence, and ambiguity are treated as data rather than deficiencies. Psychological interpretation has been deliberately constrained. No post hoc diagnosis is offered. Behavior is analyzed through institutional interaction, not interior certainty. This reflects both ethical caution and evidentiary reality. Numerical claims regarding victims have been intentionally avoided or qualified. The record does not support definitive totals, and this work resists the impulse to impose them. This book does not claim to reveal the complete truth of Belle Gunness. It claims to show what the historical system was able to see, record, and carry forward, and equally importantly what it could not. Any remainder belongs not to mystery, but to limit.